scientist based in Canada, I was turned on to this sick individual, and I found this.
Hello. Hello. Check 2. Welcome everybody. Thanks for the raid, Lodane. I hope the stream went well. Thank you. Hello everyone. What's going on? Let's just go. Hard to know how to adjust my hat sometimes. Was chatty. That's good. That's what we like. That's what we like. What's going on? I gotta crack this open. Ice cold. Ice cold. Really, I was just walking around in the sun. What's up, sickos? I'm in full biogas generator research mode. Hell yeah. Love that mode. It's one of my favorite modes. I was just out walking around in the sun. I just got home. Chin chin. I'm at nice ice cold Monster Ultra red flavor. Fresh out of the fridge. I just got back from an afternoon of hanging out in the sun. Very, very lovely. Oh, sorry, that's the watermelon. It's confusing because it's a very similar color, but that's the watermelon. Very enjoyable, though. Rob has inspired me to get my Spindrift Blood Orange and Tangerine sparkling water out of the fridge. Hell yeah. That sounds good. Like I was saying the other day, we've come a long way. I know it's easy to be depressed about the state of the world, and there's all kinds of things to feel depressed about. But we have come a long way with our flavored sparkling water technology, and I think we should be able to acknowledge that. Truly at its pinnacle with Spindrift. That's interesting. Spindrift, huh? I must not be able to get it because of my nanny state Canadian government. They don't want us to have the good stuff. We get the second tiers. Then we get some not bad second tier sparkling beverages. But beverages, incredible things are happening with the beverages. You know, we kind of make fun of capitalism a lot, obviously, and how the illusion of choice and all this stuff, and about how all our workplace protections have been traded away, and it's this social Darwinist hell of trying to climb over everyone else and debt and all the horrible consequences of that economic system. But we say, we can choose all these different breakfast cereals, right? And that's supposed to be we're trading away everything. We're trading away our humanity, our dignity, and for whatever breakfast cereals, which is all just different shapes of corn with different chemicals in it. But in all honesty, even despite knowing this illusion, when you do go to the grocery store, or especially if you go to the corner store, the dépanneur, the bodega, whatever it's called regionally, culturally, the 7-Eleven, what have you, you go down, hot summer day, you look at the big fridge with all the different beverages in it and stuff, and I gotta say, that's pretty sick. That is pretty sick. You know, when you see all just the big rack of all the different, it's okay, this is pretty good stuff, I gotta say. I must admit. It's my most shameful admission. I think it's cool there are now 5 different shades of Gatorade Blue. I have to remember which one I like. I guess it does go too far. It is possible to go too far with that. Bourgeois decadence. I do love seeing the rack of ice cold beverages. I must admit. And, after the revolution, if we have to give up our beverage choices, of course I will. I'm not saying I won't give it up. I will. If that's what we have to do. If it comes down to, like, having socialism, having a system that values, human dignity and cooperation and solidarity, and if we have to give up some of our beverage choices to get there, happy to do it. Believe me. I'm happy to do it. Just say the word and I'll snap my fingers and we'll take away the beverages. It's fine. I'm just saying, though, while the system is here, in all its horrors, in all its contradictions, in all the ways that it's exploitative and horrific, while it's here, you might as well just enjoy the different beverages, the different options, It doesn't mean you want it to stay, doesn't mean you want to keep it. Oh, I didn't reset? Oh, shit. Thanks for the reminder. My, glasses are getting foggy because I'm kind of warm. I was just outside. And then walked home, came right in here and fired up the stream. I'm overheating over here. Yeah, I just went out this morning to, I met with our friend Andre Goulet of Harbinger Media. Andre Goulet, frequent guest of the show. And our friend Nashua Khan, you might know from Twitter. Famous Twitter user Nashua. And Andre and I went out to get a breakfast this morning because Nashua's in Montreal. And it was nice. I went on a little stroll. Got a nice little breakfast. Got to hang out with those two. Andre gave me a book. Look at this. I got a new book. New book. So it was a nice little 10 a.m. to noon hangout. And a nice little meal. And now I'm back. I'm back in the basement. Ready to go. New Parenti acquired. That's right. Yeah, so it was fun. It was a nice little afternoon hang. Nice little afternoon hang. New Parenti acquired. I really need to get Inventing Reality. There's a bookstore near me too. It opens at weird hours. There's a bookstore right near me that has a bunch of political books. Oh, it's Dirty Truths. Moss World. Dirty Truths by Michael Parenti. The eye-opening and entertaining collection of essays investigates media and culture, conspiracy and state power, ideology and political consciousness. Parenti ranges over such crucial issues as free speech, the rise of neo-fascism, the overthrow of communism, the coming ecological collapse. And I don't think we credit Parenti enough for writing about ecological collapse in the late 80s and early 90s. He's really he has a really environmentalist angle on a lot of his analysis that I think we don't talk about enough. Even the Yellow Speech in general, a lot of the Yellow Speech was about the that's not exactly environmental because it was the anti-nuclear movement, but not nuclear reactors, but nuclear weapons. So that's kind of not the same thing. Not to mix and match that whole argument about energy and environmentalism and nuclear and all that stuff. The relationship between wealth and poverty, the terrorism hype, the continuing mystifications about the Kennedy assassination, and the deceptions and injustices of U.S. corporate global domination. So I've got Black Shirts and Reds, I've got Dirty Truths, I've got Against Empire. I just need to pick up Inventing Reality. And I'm going to have a nice little Parenti collection here. Out of curiosity, how long will it take you to read that book? Once I actually start reading it, not long. That's the question of where it fits into the... I'm currently reading another Parenti book now, so I have to finish that at least first. That should be pretty cool, though. But that was nice. We had a nice meal. It was fun to catch up with both of them. I gotta get Nashwa on the show more. She's a great guest. She's been on the podcast, and she's been on both of the Insurgents podcast and the previous one as well. Love Nashwa. How was the Aaron Good interview? Well, thank you, Sans Dan Bongino. I was just going to mention this. One sec. I really got started in a hurry here. I know how traumatizing it is for everyone when I look at the camera and I'm not wearing my glasses, so I don't want to put you through that again. But it was great. It was really great, the Aaron Good interview. Really cool because I didn't know much about Aaron's work until a couple weeks ago when we got connected by one of you. It was one of you that connected us, which was very cool. Didn't know much about his work until, sorry, don't want the echo. I'm just going to my own page to find the highlight for you. I'm just going to post the link in the chat to the VOD if anyone wants to watch it. And I really didn't prepare. I really did not prepare all that much for the interview. In fact, I was a little bit anxious about it for that reason. But I kind of figured that since this is exactly like what we talk about on this show repeatedly, the whole JFK and the role of the CIA they played in the assassination and American foreign policy and all these deep political events. We talk about it constantly. So didn't really prepare all that much, but it was a really great conversation and I really enjoyed it. Aaron's definitely going to have to come back, I think. It's Nashua with a W, actually. Yeah. That was really good stuff, Aaron Good. What did you think of that, folks? What did you think of the Aaron Good interview? I thought it was really good. It was one of those ones I kind of came out feeling like, oh, wow, that was really fun. I'm getting into Nixon. I think that's going to be one of my new things. All-timer segment. There we go. I liked it. Very bold stance. Let's become Nixon people. I think we should do that. I think we should we've talked about the 60s a lot and JFK, and I think Nixon is another figure it's very interesting to dive into. I was just hanging out with Andre. I was talking about that book Nixon Land because he's reading the Reagan Land, the sequel. I think we got to read that Nixon autobiography, Nixon Land, folks. I think there's, in terms of the answers which we seek in this community, the answers about the real power that controls our society. Some of the answers are there in that Nixon stuff. Hunter S. Thompson was obsessed with him. I mean, that whole generation was. That whole generation was obsessed with him, and rightfully so in a number of ways. Like, he was the villain. He was the ultimate supreme villain to the hippie generation. And a lot of that was very well deserved, obviously. Like, when you get into Nixon and talking about the role that he played, you obviously you can acknowledge that he's a right-wing conservative and a war criminal and was a terrible person on a number of levels. But I think occupied kind of an interesting role as someone that tried to, like we talked about with Aaron yesterday, tried to wrestle power back from that entrenched intelligence establishment community and national security establishment, tried to reestablish the executive branch as being the top level of power in the United States government. And I think for that exact reason was led to his downfall. Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail reread. Secret Honor. Which is Secret Honor? We could watch Frost Nixon as well. An Altman movie. Interesting. I mean, it's definitely follows Richard Nixon as a fictional account attempting to gain insight. Very interesting. I liked Frost Nixon at the time as well. Yeah. I think we might end up reevaluating it and seeing that there's a lot of liberal bullshit in there. That's my initial thought. Yeah, I really think I'd like Nixon Land is another book that's gonna have to go on the list. It's not gonna have to go on the list. In fact, you know what? You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go into Amazon.ca right now, right this moment, and I'm gonna type in Nixon Land, and I'm gonna add Nixon Land to my Amazon wish list. There we go. There we go. It's on there. Stop talking about Frost Nixon and get Secret Honor built. The Invisible Bridge and Reaganland are also great. I really got to get through all these books. Like, God, I've got all the books to really put together a really detailed historical picture of a lot of stuff that I think would really help to have that knowledge, and I just need to make the time to get through it all. Do what I did, start a third book club, and it'll allow you to hold yourself accountable. Should I go with no hat? I guess this is fine for now. I think one thing that Nixon, like the film, really kind of the idea that it introduced was that Nixon really was, even though he was evil in many respects, he was still like on the outside looking in of that elite bubble, and he had a lot of power in the Republican Party from his own like years of putting together these coalitions. But someone that grew up poor, like he was a U.S. president that grew up poor, which is very rare. And I think he didn't feel like he was part of the whole elite circles of the private schools and the people that ran Washington, and he had this level of like resentment towards everyone. Because he felt that he was like that incorrectly in many ways felt that he was being like looked down on and judged constantly, because he wasn't part of this like elite club. Yeah, Devil's Chessboard demonstrates that part pretty well. It's like yet another book that I have on my shelf behind me that I also need to get to. To be honest, I would love to do the book clubs, honestly. I would love to be able to do one of the book clubs, which is like part of this community. You know, this community, which started from this show, which now apparently doesn't even matter. Now there's people in the Discord that are like, who's that? What's this? Who's that guy, Rob? I have no idea who that is. I have no idea who that is. No clue who it is. So you'd think I should be able to attend some of the clubs in this community. I just started the Discord and just walked away. Exactly. This is just the lifestyle, though. This is the lifestyle that I got. It's hard. It's hard to squeeze in the time to do that. I actually saw... Rob, we should check that guy out sometime. Hello, good old Rob. Hey, famous source. What's up? I actually saw an interesting quote from Nixon. Let me see if I bookmarked that. I think I did. I saw a really interesting quote from Nixon, very relevant to everything going on right now. From when he's old. In 1992, like right before he died. Check this out. This is really interesting. This is Nixon talking about Russia, discussing the future of Russia. Nixon in 1992, so right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Check this out.
Well, Russia at the present time is at a crossroads. It is often said that the Cold War is over and that the West has won it. That's only half true, because what has happened is that the communists have been defeated. But the ideas of freedom now are on trial. If they don't work, there will be a reversion to not communism, which has failed, but what I call a new despotism, which would pose a mortal danger to the rest of the world, because it would be infected with the virus of Russian imperialism, which of course has been a characteristic of Russian foreign policy for centuries.
He sounds like our anarchist friends when he talks like that.
With that.
And our social democrat friends.
The West has, the United States has, all those who want peace and freedom in the world, a great stake in freedom succeeding in Russia. If it succeeds, it will be an example for others to follow. It will be an example for China, for example, to follow, for the other communist states, the few that remain. If it fails, it means that the hardliners in China will get a new life. They will say, it failed there, there's no reason for us to turn to democracy. That's part of what is at stake here.
That old tricky dick. Sometimes he said some smart stuff. Rare, punished, exiled Nixon. Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes, and again, you can sift through the right-wing bullshit there. Sorry, let's get that gone. About Russian imperialism or whatever, which again sounds indiscriminate, like completely identical to things that like our friends in the social democrat or anarchist movement say. Russian imperialism, but I think it's a very interesting point there, talking about how these ideas are kind of being on trial, and if this doesn't work, it's going to lead to a big reactionary backlash, and it's going to lead to a backlash there, and it's going to embolden Chinese Marxists. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Literally, this is a guy to the left of Obama. Yeah. Yeah, Nixon, didn't you literally steal all your own elections? What the fuck are you talking about, a democracy? Yeah. And someone who was also undemocratically, he was undemocratically elected, most likely, and undemocratically left office. You know, partially because he was being undermined by the exact same entrenched establishment of national security and intelligence interests that he was trying to get in line. You know how much you have to buy votes and do illegal shit to win elections. Shut up about democracy. Yeah. Oliver Stone's Nixon shifted my thinking on him. Well, we were just talking about that. I just watched that the other day. Really interesting movie, and yeah, interesting, sympathetic in an interesting way as well. I saw Oliver Stone a few weeks ago in Quebec City talk about his work, and he mentioned Nixon, and he reiterated that people should watch it, like when I saw him a couple of weeks ago. And he was mentioning his father too as being like a figure that was informing his thinking about Nixon and his portrayal in that movie. It was very, very interesting. Oh, no problem, Stargazer. No problem. Amazing performance by Anthony Hopkins as well. Amazing performance by Anthony Hopkins. In fact, let's find the scene. Let's find the deleted scene. I think Sin Chow posted this in the Discord the other day, but let's take a look at it again. The scene where Nixon, about this, and we talked about this yesterday, when Nixon meets with CIA Director Richard Helms. This scene was cut out of the final film. Jesus, stop. Jesus Christ. This was cut out of the final film. It is a really, really interesting scene in the movie. Oh, I got it from Aaron Good. Well, there you go. Look at that. The TRRS full circle. Why did that turn gray? Hey. Hey. What the heck? Oh, did I turn down the... There we go. It's the opacity. The old opacity. Okay. So, yeah, this is... there's no way we can report the news now. This is when Nixon meets with CIA Director Richard Helms. Really interesting scene, and I think gets into what we were talking about yesterday. The way that Nixon butted heads with the intelligence community as well.
Mr. President. Bob? I don't know what to say, sir. As soon as we learned from the Secret Service that you were en route,
let me just gonna boost the sound a little bit. One moment.
Mr. President. Bob? I don't know what to say, sir. As soon as we learned from the Secret Service that you were en route, the director was notified. He should be here any minute.
Oh? Where the hell is he?
Well, he's rushing back from his tennis game, sir.
So, let's go.
He told me to take you to his conference room, sir.
No, his office. I want a very private conversation with him. I don't want to be bugged.
Then his office will be fine, sir.
Okay.
Amazing performance by Anthony Hopkins in this movie.
All right.
Yeah, run.
How's the job?
Incredible performance.
Frankly, it stinks, sir. I have no...
I don't know who won the
access.
Oscar this year, but Hopkins is just incredible in this.
He's nervous, sir. He's heard you're looking for a new director.
Certainly isn't acting like it.
That's Helms. He's the epitome of sang-froid. A world-class poker player.
Yeah? Well, I own the fucking casino.
Hey, Squatch.
I'm honored, Dick, that you've come all the way out here to Virginia to
Calls him
visit
Dick.
us at last.
My friends call me Mr. President.
And so shall I. Arrange for some coffee. Will you, General Cushman?
Gentlemen, please.
Oh man, did Hanks win the Oscar? Is this the year that Hanks won the Oscar for Forrest Gump? Man, the Forrest Gump phenomenon. That's a very interesting movie just to look at in retrospect. But I think it very silly in hindsight that cleaned up while this was kind of forgotten. This performance was kind of forgotten. Forrest Gump is like the fucking... It's the panopticon of boomer propaganda. The whole boomer mind, like, worldview is really wrapped up in that movie. No wonder it was such a big sensation. Talk about a movie, too, that has had no lasting cultural imprint. You know, that movie was a huge sensation in 1995 and has... It's never, like, not a movie that people rewatch. It's basically looked back on kind of embarrassingly with the accent.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Gump has a great boomer soundtrack.
That is true, obviously. Thank you, Typo Chad House. That is true. And, you know, as you all know, I do love my boomer music. Would be interesting as a rewatch, though, just to, like, study the boomer mind. If you want to understand the boomer mind, you watch Forrest Gump, and you can understand kind of how they view their role in the world. if you want to understand that, even though Biden's too old to be a boomer, but you know how Biden always talks about like the civil rights movement, like we won civil rights and we did all this stuff, and that's why you can never complain about anything. We were getting shot and kids were getting shot in Kent State. And we ended the Vietnam War, and we passed the civil rights legislation, and they all just think that was their generation they accomplished that, and then that they can just coast on that and then for the rest of their lives. 40 years later, they can still lecture people about complaining about anything because they're just coasting on that. Yeah. For some reason, Vietnam movies, you always have the CCR in there. You always have the CCR. Yeah, all these white former hippies who became Reaganites afterwards, taking the credit for work and activism that people of color, the Black Panthers and other people of color did. Yeah, Lieutenant Dan gets metal legs and a Vietnamese wife, and everything is fine. And they stand. Jesus Christ, Forrest Gump. But just the original point, though, that it's amazing that performance was like the toast of award season. Tom Hanks as being in that performance in Forrest Gump, and the Anthony Hopkins' fucking incredible performance in this movie was barely mentioned beyond the critics or whatever.
Bob Cushman is Lieutenant General in the Marine Corps, Deputy Director of the CIA. This is what you use him for?
I didn't choose him as my deputy, Mr. President. You did.
Well, you live pretty well out here. I understand why you want to keep your budgets classified.
I suppose you're unhappy because I haven't implemented your domestic intelligence plan.
Yeah, you're correct. I'm concerned these students are being funded by foreign interests, whether they know it or not. The FBI is useless in this area. I want your full attention on this matter.
Of course, we've tried, but so far we've come up with nothing that...
Then find something. And I want these leaks stopped. Jack Anderson, the New York Times, the State Department. I want to know who's talking to them.
I'm sure you realize, Mr. President, that this is a very tricky area, given our charter and the Congressional Oversight Committee.
Oh, screw congressional oversight. I know damn well, going back to the 50s, this agency reports what it wants and buries what it doesn't want Congress to know. I'll pay close attention to this.
Is there something else that's bothering you, Mr. President?
Yes. It involves some old and forgotten papers, things I signed as Vice President. I want the originals in my office, and I don't want copies anywhere else.
Old Dutch, he's meeting with CIA Director Richard Helms. I just wanted to talk about this scene again in the context of Nixon and everything, and the conversation we had yesterday with Aaron Good about how Nixon, for all his faults and corruption and imperfections and sort of criminality, was someone that did clash with the very same entrenched intelligence interests who assassinated JFK. And I think that directly led to his inglorious exit and kind of sort of exile from political life.
You're referring, I believe, to chairing the Special Operations Group as Vice President.
Yeah.
As you know, that was unique. Not an operation so much as an organic phenomenon. It grew, it changed shape, it developed appetites. It's not unusual in such cases that things are not committed to paper. That could be very embarrassing. I, for one, saw to it that my name was never connected with any of these operations. Zion. Trujillo. Lumumba. Guatemala. Iran. Cuba.
It's a shame you didn't take similar precautions, Dick.
You think that's TOS from an Oliver Stone movie, Outrun?
I'm interested in those documents that put your people together with the gangster elements.
I can nuke the VOD if it's a problem.
All the documents. President Kennedy threatened to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. You could do the same. I'm not Jack Kennedy. Your agency is secure. Not if I give you all the cards. I promised the American people peace with honor in Southeast Asia. Now, that may take time, 2, maybe 3 years. But in the meantime, your agency will continue at current levels of funding. Current levels may not be sufficient.
These motherfuckers. Current levels might not be sufficient. Yeah, I think possibly Lodane in this scene there was possibly real clips of like historical footage of gore stuff. I would say it's from a deleted scene. Yeah, I would say probably we will nuke the VOD after looking at this scene just to be totally safe there.
While the president will support a reasonable request for an increase. And me? Of course, you will continue as DCI, Dick. You're doing a magnificent job. Of course, I accept. I'm flattered. And I want you to know that I serve only one president at a time. Yes.
Well, yeah, I like how in this scene the CIA is above the president. That's it. He walks in and the guy's just like, "Oh, hey, Dick," like very pointedly. Yeah, Sam is so good for sure. Yeah, he's so sinister. He's so fucking sinister in this. There's actually a moment in this scene, and God, I really love Oliver Stone. There's a moment in this scene where Sam Waterston's eyes turn entirely black. There's a moment where he's looking at his flowers. There's like a brief moment where his eyes are like completely black. Nixon is really like does not hold back with how he views these fucking ghouls, these demons. Like we were talking about with Aaron yesterday, we're not talking about people that made mistakes. Good people, good intentioned people that made mistakes. We're talking about evil people in an evil enterprise. And Oliver Stone is not shy about indicating his feelings on that. Nixon was saving us from the deep state, brother. Watergate was a fraud. Again, Bettingham, this is kind of the idea that Stone kind of lays out. And like while recognizing that Nixon himself was a right-wing a sort of autocrat and wannabe autocrat in many ways, who has also had his own issues with corruption and was a war criminal. All this is true. But the question is was there an element of truth to that? Did he butt heads with the CIA guys? Did he try to kind of like reestablish the executive branch as being the ultimate power? And did he end up getting tossed aside by the very same people?
And you will give General Cushman full access. It could take a little time.
This is the problem. He wants access to like their secrets, so he has leverage over them. That's the kind of, and I don't know how much of this scene is based on reality or how much of it is just a fictional thing based on like based on meeting notes or ideas. You know, I'm not really sure what level of access led to this scene, but that's definitely the theory that is laid out, which is that he wanted access to their secrets, including secrets about the JFK assassination, so he would have some kind of leverage over them.
But I'll order a search for your papers. Good. So it does raise a troubling issue. What? Castro. Yes. We have recent intelligence that a Soviet nuclear submarine has docked at Cienfuegos. Well, we'll lodge a formal protest. I don't think we can treat this as a formality.
Mr. Kennedy gave the Russians a verbal promise that he would not invade Cuba. But you authorized Dr. Kissinger to put this in writing?
Are you tapping Kissinger?
My job, unpleasant at times, is to know what others don't want me to know.
Not if you have spies in the White House, it isn't.
It is not my practice to spy on the president. Dr. Kissinger manages to convey his innermost secrets to the world at large without my help.
Dick, we've lived with communism in Cuba for 10 years.
But it has never been the policy of this government to accept that. And it is certainly not CIA policy.
CIA policy? The CIA has no policy except what I dictate to you. I try to adjust to the world as it is today, not as you or I wanted it to be 10 years ago.
Is that why you and Kissinger are negotiating with the Chinese? This is a very dangerous direction, Mr. President. Terrible consequences can result from such enormous errors of judgment.
But if we were able to separate China from Russia once and for all, we could create a balance of power that would secure the peace into the next century.
And offer Cuba to the Russians as a consolation prize?
Cuba would be a small price to pay.
So President Kennedy thought.
No, I never thought Kennedy was ready for the presidency.
Kennedy really looms large over this film, too. He's constantly referenced.
I would never consider his death was awful. It's an awful thing for this country.
Yeah.
Do you ever think of death, Dick?
Flowers are a continual
I think this is
reminder
it.
of our mortality. Do you appreciate flowers?
No. Well, they make me sick. They smell like death. I had 2 brothers die young. Well, let me tell you, there are worse things than death.
Yes.
Look at his eyes. fucking Oliver Stone. What a guy. What a guy, that Oliver Stone. Really something else.
There are worse things than death.
Yes.
There's such a thing as evil.
You must be familiar with my favorite poem by Yeats, The Second Coming. Black Irish, very moving.
You're the rough beast, sir.
In the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And everywhere the ceremony of innocence is lost. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. But it ends so beautifully ominous.
I like the heavy-handedness as well.
What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Yes. This country stands at such a juncture.
Awesome scene. Awesome scene. What, there was, hold on, there was more Punish Nixon. There's more Punish Nixon here. Only one man would make a movie like this. That's right. That's right. In those moments, you got to go with those bold choices. Why was it cut? I don't know. Maybe perhaps because it was a little heavy-handed. I think ultimately the movie kind of suggests that this kind of took place without getting into the explicit details of it. I think that's ultimately the choice that gets made. I think that scene really spells out that thesis about Nixon and the CIA. And I think in the actual film, in the actual cut, the finished cut of the movie, that's more kind of implied. You know, I like the scene. I like how it's spelled out like that, but I don't know if it would make the movie, if it would fit and if it would work in the movie or not. Quotes Yates to him. I know Nixon hates this Ivy League WASP MF. I love how Hopkins is all like shifty and kind of looking down too. It's like we were talking about the question of like who has the power in that room. You know, it's really, and how it's presented in the blocking and the staging and everything. Really cool. The dark eyes were a little on the nose. Yeah. Maybe we could have done without that. Although again, I like those bold choices though. I like those bold choices. Like Oliver Stone is completely unapologetic in framing these people as like fucking evil, which they are, you know? We don't need to be nuanced about it. I think it's bold to make those kinds of choices. You know, this is not nuanced. It's not about shades of gray. We're dealing with fucking ultimate evil. We're dealing with actual demons here. You know, I like that. From the moment he enters, he's being given orders. Yeah, seriously. It's very, very interesting. Very interesting. Let's look at more Punish Nixon while we're talking about this. The CIA is going goblin mode. That's right. Let's see more from Punish Nixon. This is Nixon on Larry King in 1990.
Nixon, last week was the anniversary, if that's the correct term, of the horror that took place at Kent State. As you reflect back on that whole episode, the Vietnam War and everything.
I think it's in only 1 year.
Do you ever think maybe we should never have gone there in the first place? That Eisenhower was wrong to send the first advisor?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you could say that Eisenhower was wrong to send the first advisor. Some say that. And others say that Kennedy was wrong to send in the first 15,000 combat troops and suffer the first casualties, and that Johnson was wrong in escalating it to 550,000, and that I was wrong for not just washing my hands of it and blame the whole thing on Kennedy and Johnson, who'd sent in Americans for the first time.
You could have walked away.
I could have walked away, and many of my advisors agreed that I should, but it would have been wrong to do so.
Why?
It would have been wrong to do so because
it actually would have been correct to do so.
South Vietnam was a country that was trying to resist the domination of North Vietnam. North Vietnam was supported by the Chinese communists and the Soviet communists. If Vietnam at that time had been overrun by the North Vietnamese, there's no question, going back to the time when, in the early 60s, when our activities there began to increase, there's no question but that communist tide would have rolled through the balance of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and the rest. Now, some say that wasn't going to happen. Believe me, it would have happened. We at least stopped it there. Later
Monstrous.
on, Congress hadn't failed to provide the funds that we should have had as a result of the Paris Peace Agreement.
Well, I think they were supported by China up to the Sino-Soviet split, and then there was the whole conflict with like the Sino-Vietnam War after the split, when the Soviets backed the Vietnamese, and then China was kind of like, China fought the Vietnamese as well, and I believe China backed the Khmer Rouge as well, right? The CIA and China both came together to back the Pol Pot and the brutal Khmer Rouge regime, right? That whole period following, you can talk about the Sino-Soviet split and like, especially in retrospect, and talk about who was in the more correct position. Unequivocally, though, I think, regardless of what the split was about, constant L's in foreign policy for China at this time. Constant unforgivable L's for all of like the 70s and early 80s, I think. Even if we can talk about how Khrushchev and the legitimate criticisms of Khrushchev and the way that the Soviet Union entered in this like state of ongoing collapse, basically starting from that period, they did still correctly back Vietnam, and they did correctly back a number of international socialist projects that then, after the split, yeah, the Sino-Soviet split just made no one look good and just hurt both. Although you could argue that it helped ingratiate China to the U.S., which you could argue they needed to do these things to indicate to the Americans that they were on board, which would then allow them to develop over the next couple of decades while relatively being left alone without fear of being kind of like sanctioned or overthrown. And how much of that was just like bad foreign policy decisions that then ended up getting like used for that reason? How much of it was intentionally and deliberately trying to ingratiate themselves to the West? I don't know. I'm not sure. Khrushchev domestic policy was bad, but he stood up for his homies abroad. Yeah. Yeah, it may have saved China. This is what I mean. It's hard to say. I still think regardless of that, it's like a number of really horrible foreign policy decisions, absolutely. Regardless of any of that stuff, any of that context. Sandwich report: turkey, bacon, cucumber, cheddar, fresh dill, and mayo on rye, paired with a Diet Coke and some veggie straws. That sounds wonderful, Old Dutch. Sounds wonderful. By the way, there's also an amazing scene in Nixon. We could watch that after. There's the scene where Nixon and Kissinger go meet Mao. Like, that scene is in the movie. That's really interesting. We could watch that as well. Pretty fascinating stuff. And I think this is one of the things that the Nixon movie kind of gets across, which is just like, again, and acknowledging that Cambodia and the escalation of the bombing campaign in Cambodia and elsewhere was just a horrendous crime, a horrendous, unforgivable crime. But I think the point that comes across in Nixon was that any other president probably would have had, with the legacy that Nixon had, with the war ending, with some of the economic policies they made, with launching like the EPA and a number of other things. Like, there's a legacy there that for most presidents that would be like a known as being like this historic, successful administration. But Nixon, because of what happened with the Watergate scandal and the way that tied his whole presidency, he'll forever be seen as this corrupt failure. But like, that's the kind of point that gets made in this movie, is that he was really on the verge of what would end up being considered this really historically successful administration that got bogged down by this scandal, which was fairly like the whole Watergate thing was like a minor botched burglary that didn't really have to explode in the way that it did. Like, again, the bombing of Cambodia is a significantly more horrific crime than like burglarizing some fucking hotel. Let's see more of punished, exiled Nixon.
Did those 58,000 die in vain?
No, they did not die in vain. Certainly we can look back to the over 50,000 that died in Korea, and we're sure they didn't die in vain, because now we have South Korea, which is one of the most vibrant economies in the world, will be a competitor with the Japanese in 50 years, perhaps. As far as the ones in Vietnam,
they died committing a horrible fucking crime.
When you see what
genocidal crime.
The boat people drowning in the South China Sea, 600,000. When you see what has happened in Cambodia, those are the things we were attempting to prevent. We realized that we were on the right course. And I would say that when we recognize that as a result of what we did there, that we were able to hold the line against Soviet communist aggression and Chinese aggression for that period of time, that bought time.
They were in Vietnam, and it was Soviet aggression.
Southeast Asia to develop their own strength.
They're in Korea. They're in Vietnam, committing mass murder, genocidal mass murder campaign, and torturing people, burning villagers, burning children alive, bombing all of Korea's infrastructure, killing 3 million people, 20% of the country, whatever it is. But we were preventing aggression, though. We were preventing Soviet and Chinese aggression, you see, with this mass murder campaign that we were responsible for there. when we dropped more bombs than the entirety of World War II combined, on these nations. We were preventing Soviet aggression. It's unbelievable the way that they're able to justify. There's no crime. That's the whole thing with Nixon and with the CIA, with as much as they butted heads for any of these anti-communist types. There is no crime that was not justified. No, the worst things you can possibly imagine, which they did in that region at that time. Nothing was not justified, because for them, it's the whole better dead than red philosophy. That's what anti-communist foreign policy is. It's like we're the ones that are killing millions, literally millions of people in the most horrific fashion imagined, but it's them, it's the others that are being aggressive. It's the Soviet Union that's being aggressive. It's China that's being aggressive. It's just really amazing the way that they justify such horror, such like just the absolute depravity. Cambodia, the bombing of Cambodia under Nixon and Kissinger. It's just like absolutely horrific to think about. But they still sit around and talk about Soviet aggression. It's really remarkable the way these people were able to justify such just like horrible, horrible violence that they committed. But you see that that's what anti-communism is. That's what the whole United States foreign policy was following the war. And there's absolutely no crime great enough that was not totally justified. It's pretty fucking horrific.
I do not believe, for example, that Thailand or Indonesia or even the Philippines would be safe today.
It's talking about Indonesia being safe, like we talked about yesterday, a mass murder campaign of millions of people after the overthrow of Sukarno in Indonesia, with the CIA, which he butted heads with, were directly responsible for. They killed millions of people, murdered them. And he's talking about, we saved Indonesia. We saved Indonesia. Imagine what would be going on with Indonesia if we hadn't been doing that. It's like fucking delusional. It was so safe they could do a genocide. That's right. It's unbelievably delusional, this mindset. All this talk of Nixon jogged something in my memory. If I may beg your indulgence, you may know this no empathy clip from Grandpa Joe Biden. Yeah, we just watched it the other day. I always watch the no empathy clip. Let's continue with Punish Nixon now. Yeah, the Philippines, who we made our colony. We committed mass murder there as well to make our distinct colony. Imagine how they wouldn't have been safe if we hadn't been there to do that. Yeah, Obama's stepdad just happened to be involved in the military that did that. Yeah, we were saying the other day, Obama shows up, old Barry shows up in the Jakarta Method. His State Department mom, who was married to a Indonesian anti-communist military guy who was involved in this mass murder campaign. Oh yeah, in that clip he says 17 died at Kent State. Yeah, that's not accurate. Yeah, look at these wars the USSR, China, and the DPRK started. Clearly communists are the aggressors and not the capitalists every single time. It's just really remarkable, like the level of violence and depravity. And it's just, to them, it's just all justified. And then they just look at the Korean economy and they'll look, now the Korean economy is really good. So it's, all of that was worth it. The 50,000 Americans that died at the making this happen, and the 3 million Koreans that died, that we directly murdered. God, it's horrible. What does imperialism do? Remember what imperialism does? It turns men into beasts, doesn't it? It turns men into depraved beasts, and this is how they justify it.
Had the North Vietnamese, with Soviet and Chinese support, succeeded in dominating that peninsula earlier on, 10 years before.
What is it like?
And also, by the way, just going back to the stuff about how Nixon would generally be remembered as someone who was incredibly successful, the whole opening up China would be a big part of that as well. Like that's, especially in the 80s, that looked like the big, most consequential foreign policy decision of many American presidencies. So it's like there is a case to be made, regardless of all the monstrous shit that Nixon stood for, which obviously is true. But just that in and of itself, the China stuff and ending the war in Vietnam, would, for most other presidencies, would be viewed as huge historic successes. That was always the kind of level of frustration, and I think a tension with Nixon too, where he just like he didn't feel like he got any credit for any of that stuff because he was like on the outside looking in. He wasn't part of these like elite clubs. But yeah, important to point that out and point out his butting heads with the intelligence establishment, while also acknowledging a lot of the monstrous stuff that he stood for in his own right.
The president gets to do this, but what is it like to do it, to send men to die? What is it?
Being president during a war is difficult. It is difficult to write the letters. It is difficult. I used to make Christmas telephone calls to the next of kin. It is difficult to present medals to the survivors, those who've been killed, including Congressional Medal of Honor winners. It's difficult to talk to the people the wives and children and loved ones of POWs. You know, we talk about our hostages today, and they're in 3-4 years or whatever. We've had POWs that were in for 7 years, and how those men came out and what they've done is one of the epic great stories in American history.
But do you ever feel a personal kind of, I know they said Johnson did at the end, felt a personal tragedy over Vietnam and took upon himself the weight of the dead.
Yeah, you could have just not done it. You could have just not escalated
Vietnam
escalated it.
All the time I was president. And there was nothing that meant more to me than to end the war, to bring our POWs home, to have the Paris Peace Agreement, to end the draft, and finally to get the nation on another course. And I only regret that the Congress didn't continue to provide the funds so that we could have kept South Vietnam free, which we could have done.
There was a plan.
You know, there's really interesting, something I've talked about before as well, but something I would like to look into more sometime. How, you know, the war ended in 1975, and you can give all these kind of like political, oh yeah, we ended the war, we got peace with honor, whatever it is, whatever Nixon said. But like, there's also a case looking into like the state of the U.S. military in 1975, or like, let's say 1973, like shortly before the war was over. I think it's understated how close the United States military was to just going into like open revolt. Like, I think it got a lot closer than a lot of these people would like to acknowledge. All the stuff about, you know, in Vietnam, just no one was following orders anymore. Constantly, people were being like, officers were being murdered by their own platoons, like constant people going AWOL. It was like, and it was completely endemic throughout the whole military establishment in Vietnam, and it was spreading elsewhere. Like, there's a lot of argument to be made that like, not only was like it diplomatically, did they want to get out for diplomatic reasons, but they literally had to end the war to get their troops out of there, because they were in this state of like almost completely losing control, like over their military. It was really close to just completely coming apart at the seams. And I think that played a significant role in the war ending. You know, there was like radical activism at the time around the Vietnam War, with the draft and everything too, where there was even like, there was efforts to like have pamphlets for people to be like, if you get drafted into the Vietnam War, don't escape, don't go to Canada, go to Vietnam and like shoot your commanding officer. Like, that was like, there was radical parts of the anti-war movement that were deliberately trying to like send people there to go into open revolt and to like kill their commanding officers, which happened constantly. They had to change how they documented friendly fire so it wasn't clear how many officers were getting blasted. Yeah, seriously. Like, I think this is sort of an unexplored avenue that I would like to get into sometime.
Plan? It was often said there was no Nixon plan.
Oh, at the beginning of my administration, oh yes. The plan was simply to go to the source. The plan was to develop relationships between the United States and China, and the United States and the Soviet Union, who were the two major sponsors of North Vietnam.
So
and it almost worked.
Then those overtures had Vietnam in mind.
Always. They weren't the only reasons that we did that. Without Vietnam, I would have still gone to China. Without Vietnam, I would have still opened the relations with the Soviet Union. But that was one of the byproducts that I hoped would be served.
Now, Richard Nixon was if not a China baiter, I remember when Adlai Stevenson in 1956, in that campaign, called for recognition of Red China, and I think you lambasted him as that was pinko, and he was way off in left field. And then, some years later, who opens the doors but Richard Nixon? Were those two Nixons?
No.
And I think, as Nixon pointed out at the time, as others pointed out, like, he really is the only person that could have created this diplomatic relationship and recognized the Chinese government, like recognized the CPC as the dominant official recognized rulers of China. Like, no Democrat president could have done that. Like, that is actually true. No, if Jimmy Carter or whoever else had tried to do that, they would have been absolutely annihilated. And Nixon, in many ways, was the only one that could go do that because he had these right-wing anti-communist credentials. Yeah, I think there's truth to that. This only Nixon could go to China thing. Maybe eventually it would have happened, but I don't think at that time, I don't think there's no liberal would have made that move to officially recognize that. It's true, he's a master China baiter. That's right.
There were two different Chinas. Adlai Stevenson was wrong in 1956. That would have been the wrong time to recognize China, because China at that time was in an aggressive stage. It was trying to export communism all over Southeast Asia, into Africa.
We're going to get back there. We're getting back there in the next decade.
It finally turned out. At the time that I went to China, China finally had turned inward. It no longer posed a threat to us externally. And at the time,
not anymore, Dick.
China, as a result of what happened in
1969
and 1961, China and the Soviet Union had split. At the time Stevenson made that rather foolish comment, China and the Soviet Union were still locked together with the Soviet Union, the dominant partner.
So it wasn't a change of course for you. It was a practical maneuver, even though you will admit conservatives are more surprised at it than liberals.
That's right. I would have made the move to China at any time that I thought it would serve the interest of the United States. It would not have served them at that early time. It did serve the interest of the United States after China and the Soviet Union had split, and when we could have a relationship with China, a nation which I knew in the next century, with 1 billion people, would be an economic and military superpower. Better to have a relation now rather than later.
It's also amazing how that didn't leak. And you pulled off secret trips.
It's amazing. It's great credit, incidentally, to the people in our administration, but let me also say it gives great credit to Henry Kissinger. I know there's a tendency later to knock Henry because they say that he took a different view than I did on some of these things. We all had the same goals. We disagreed on tactics. But Henry Kissinger knew how to play the great game of geopolitics. He was the best. And without him, we couldn't have done it. I think he would agree, without me, we couldn't have done it.
Now we'll talk about things in China.
Maybe some truth to that. I don't know.
Right after this.
Maybe some truth to it. Kissinger, obviously, also a horrific criminal. Nixon. No. Let's see if I can find the seed.
I must say you look very good, Mrs. Chairman.
Looks can be deceiving.
We know what risk you've taken in inviting us here.
I took no risk.
Love the editing.
I am too old to be afraid of what anyone thinks. Don't ever trust them. They never tell the truth. Honor their commitment. Vietnamese are like Russians. Both are dogs.
Mr. Chairman, there's an old saying in my country, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
That has the added virtue of being true.
Your writings have changed the world, Mr. Chairman.
但是您的著作改变的是介质，先生。
放屁。
Bullshit. My writings mean absolutely.
Yes, Sam, we only have a Deng Xiaoping emote.
I want to know your secret.
Hey, Crowd Babes, it's Anthony
My
Hopkins.
secret, Mr. Chairman.
How a fat man gets so many girls.
Power, Mr. Chairman, is the ultimate aphrodisiac.
是最有效的治疗。
Kissinger really looms large over this movie as well. He's one of the most important side characters in the movie.
You know, I voted for you in your last election.
I was the lesser of two evils.
You are too modest, Mr. Nixon. You are as evil as I am. We are the new emperors. We are both from poor families that others pay to feed the hunger in us. In my case, millions of reactionaries. In your case, millions of Vietnamese.
Civil war is always the cruelest kind of war, but our two nations were forged by revolution. The United States and China.
Yeah, an interesting observation here, Sean. I like how they don't frame this as a hopeful moment. It's still very shadowy and sinister. Yeah, and obviously drawing the parallels between Mao and Nixon themselves. It's kind of the interesting thing, though, as well, because when did this movie come out? 95. I mean, for people that were like critical of U.S. imperialism, I mean, like even it's very, very revealing reading, Parenti from the mid-90s and as well. And I think a lot of people, for very good reason, were really skeptical about China and were very skeptical about the way that China opened up to capitalist development, and that the way China did kind of assume this role as kind of like a junior partner to the United States. A lot of people, I think, even people that were dedicated, anti-imperialist and a lot of people really were very skeptical about that. And that's been, I think, that's been one of the things that I've found most fascinating about China over the last couple of years, is just the way that, like, it's become more, these decisions that were made at this time, which I think for a long time people were very cynical about and very skeptical about for a very good reason. And the way that, China became a central cog in the whole neoliberal era. Without China, there's no Walton family. Without Deng Xiaoping, without them, the neoliberal era just falls apart. That's the kind of fascinating thing about the last few years is now that more time has gone by, and I think the logic behind making these decisions is becoming a little bit more clear. Like Nixon pointed out in that clip that we looked at earlier, the failure of capitalism in these post-Soviet countries, especially Russia, has led to this entrenchment of like more hardline Marxist values in China, who don't want the same fate to come to their society, and has kind of emboldened them. That's exactly what's happened, right? So that's kind of one of the most fascinating things about China, is I think just over the last 10, 15 years, as that pendulum has swung back to the left there, and as you have President Xi Jinping like pressing the socialism button, the way people were always like demanding, and now you see them kind of starting to do it. They're actually pressing the socialism button, and they've launched, over the last 15 years, they've launched all this huge infrastructure project. They've launched the Belt and Road Initiative. Nixon was talking in that clip with Larry King about how China's turned inward and they're no longer trying to export socialism anywhere. And now you see China going out and getting involved in development in these third world countries and in Latin America and all over the place. So now I think with the context of the last 10, 15 years, these decisions that were made in the late 70s and the early 80s, which I completely understand why people were cynical and skeptical about it, do, I think, start making a lot more sense. And you're seeing the logic behind why these decisions were made and why they felt they needed to demonstrate to the West that they were willing partners and that they were going to be allies with them. and why it was very important that the West believed that and that these ties were formed and that it made them completely economically linked together. They're now like economically inseparable, as you see now, as the ruling classes in America are starting to freak out about China's growth and they're trying to sever that link. They're finding it impossible because all the supply chain and their whole global capitalist system is completely reliant on them. And so they can't just like start sanctioning them. They can't just go and start invading or overthrowing them or bombing them. Now they can't. That's the very interesting thing, is that I completely get why people were cynical about China and about these decisions. Again, Parenti is an example. He's very much, I think, in the mid 90s. Parenti is like, yeah, China is just like another kind of failed a society that is just like is subservient to the West and is like a Western partner and is not really like something worth spending all that much time and energy defending. But I think over the last 10, 15 years, that has changed. The calculus on a lot of these decisions have changed a lot. It's actually very smart in retrospect, to let financial capital invest in your industries while you maintain firm control over the banking sector in your country. Absolutely, yeah. Over the last year, there's been a 20% increase in Chinese job postings requiring advanced degrees in Marxism. I mean, this is all something that I wanted to get into as well. Someone posted, I think it was Red Scare, you posted the big celebration of the Chinese celebration, and I can't remember the exact video that you posted, but that was something that I found very inspiring and hopeful to look at, as now you see them becoming this global dominant power. I think a lot of these decisions have, in retrospect, make a lot more sense, and whether you agree or disagree, it's very easier to see like the logic of it. Yeah, and I think that's something that we should be really. I think that's really exciting and cool. The fact that this country of 1.4 billion people, the number of people that are in the Chinese Communist Party, the number of like Marxists that they're turning out, people that are dedicating years of their lives to studying Marxist theory, like this is like where the future is. That's something that's very, if you're on the left, that's something you should be thrilled about. That's why I get confused sometimes by people that are still, again, I understand being skeptical in the mid 90s. But I think the writing is on the wall now. I think it's a lot more clear now. And that's something that people should be excited about. This is like this is the future global superpower. And they're just churning out millions and millions of
count on me
Marxists.
And have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
And they're developing the global
Anybody
south.
need any drugs? Prescriptions on me. JK, not really, don't ask me for drugs. Thanks for 9 great months.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you for the 9 months resub at tier 2. And I would like some drugs, sir. No, you don't understand, Rob. Random online Western leftists who have never read any theory know more about theory and economics than China. This is what I mean. Here's the vid. Okay, thank you, Red Scary. We can look at it after. I've talked about it before, though, about how, I think sometimes people just like assume being on the left means losing all the time. And when there's a big W on the horizon, they're scared to just take it. We can actually, I've talked about this before, we can actually win. It's okay to win. Being on the left doesn't just mean just losing and being disappointed for your entire life. We'll get to this in a moment, though. I saw someone make much the same point on how the Western hegemony is falling apart and on how the multipolar world is rapidly looking to be the future. Gives me hope when it seems dark, Yeah, and Crimson, I think this is an important point. Listen, our societies don't have a lot of revolutionary potential. They don't. We have to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean we should stop trying to build socialism in the West, but let's acknowledge that that's a long way away. But that doesn't mean that things aren't, there's no reason to be hopeful, because the change is going to come from outside the empire. All these traditionally colonized, impoverished countries are all now starting to work together under this umbrella of development outside of our own influence. That's good. That's where the change is going to come from. Not from within. It's going to come from outside. as a Trailblazers fan and a leftist, I'm used to having a lot of hope than having it smashed by powers outside of my control. It's true. It's you get prepped. Usually, when you're a sports fan, you get prepped for that lifetime of losing and disappointment. And let's continue watching the rest of the scene. I just think that's how we got started talking about this. It's really framed as kind of sinister, and I understand that that exactly why in 1995, why that's how most people did view these decisions. But I think the last 10 or 15 years, and Stone acknowledges this. Like when I went to see Oliver Stone a few weeks ago, he acknowledged this as well. And he is someone that does seem quite optimistic about China and about China's development, and was defending China, and its sovereignty, as in defending their ability to kind of protect their own sovereignty, and criticizing U.S. imperialism for encircling them and harassing them constantly. I always learn so much from this stream. Most mature left discussion on Twitch I've seen so far. Thank you, Time, for some whiz-biz. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Try being a Lions fan. Oh my goodness. That sounds awful. That sounds awful. No, thank you. Although I'll say I'm a Toronto Raptors fan, folks, and we won the championship. If it can happen for the Toronto Raptors, believe me, it can happen for you. It's because we're all old here. That is part of it, isn't it? That is part of it. Well, and also it's like I think reading theory, you realize that a lot of what passes for political discussion on Twitch or debate, all this shit has just been settled. This was all settled like centuries ago sometimes. Like literally 100 years ago, these debates were settled. And we don't need to be sitting here on Twitch and debating what constitutes authoritarian or not authoritarian or whatever. Like we don't need to do that. That's already been done. There's very intelligent and clever people have done that already. They took care of all those arguments and they wrote down like what the conclusions were. And rather than having these bullshit arguments today, we can simply read the books. We can simply read the books that the answers are, and then we don't have to waste our time doing that. And then we can just take that understanding and just use that to apply that to our analysis today while skipping the whole thing about debating and all that bullshit. What books do you recommend in regards to that? I mean, Will Realms, I don't know if you're in the Discord server, but there's a theory reading club in the Discord server that I would recommend that you join. A lot of the theory reading is being done there. I mean, I would recommend State and Revolution is a great start. Is a great start in terms of understanding some of these arguments that I just mentioned that happen a lot on Twitch about the state and what the role of the state is and what constitutes a revolution and what happens in a revolution and whether a revolution, what is authoritarianism and not, how you transition from feudalism to capitalism to socialism and what that's supposed to look like. I mean, all the answers are there, and there's a whole world of theory it's beyond that. I always say start with capital. Capital is pretty intimidating, though. Jody Dean says that as conditions deteriorate in the West, it makes the conditions for revolution less daunting and closer to turn of the century Russia. Well, that's the thing. I don't want to discount that we could get to a point in the West where the decline becomes so obvious that all of a sudden it creates an opportunity, a moment of revolutionary potential. We're just so inundated with specifically anti-communist propaganda that I think even if it's good, it's possible to get people on board with certain things. The people in our society have just been hardwired to reject the solutions that we have and reject the analysis that we have. We found this pretty base Discord. I think this guy Overturn runs it. Oh my god. Oh my god. Yeah, I recommend State and Rev just because it's easy to digest. Lenin is just like I just think Lenin's a really good writer. I mean, he's funny, he's entertaining. again, State and Revolution, especially, you can read it. If you read State and Revolution and you don't look at the title and you don't like pay much attention to like who wrote it or what time, you could think that it came out in the 60s or the 70s. I mean, there's so many, again, talking about why theory is so important, because you read a book like that and you realize how applicable it is to a lot of modern issues that we deal with today or that were going on in the 60s or 70s, you know? I have a list of the starter dialectical materialism texts we read for Theory Book Club, and I feel like they give me a really good background. Yeah. I'm sorry, I had a hard time with that one, Sean. Sean Mead, of course, never says anything wrong. Oh, no. Sean Mead never misspeaks. Can just say just conjure all these words instantly. Yeah, also read Jakarta Method for just a history of U.S. imperialism if you want to shed any possibility of the U.S. being good. That's correct. He doesn't. That's what I mean. I think there's the background in theory that's important to understand, and you need to really grapple with the history of colonialism, which you can do through books like Open Veins of Latin America and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and the history of modern history of U.S. imperialism, which you can find out about in Black Shirts and Reds and Against Empire and Jakarta Method and Washington Bullets. It's having the understanding of the theory and then having no illusions about internationally who is the bad guy and the role that imperialism plays. Think of how expansive their propaganda has to be to keep people so confused about China. The more W's they post, the harder it'll be to maintain it. Yeah, I mean, I want to believe that you're right, Matt. I guess I see people that are smart falling for the anti-China propaganda now, even with all the obvious ongoing collapse of our system and all the obvious incredible growth that's happening there. You still see people getting pulled into the anti-China propaganda, even people that are like, I'm a leftist, I'm against imperialism. And they still get pulled into at the very least, they get pulled into that academic, both sides bad kind of Chomsky sort of analysis, even though Chomsky himself has been better on this as he gets to this kind of a lack of fucks, end of life thing. Let's just finish watching this clip.
Peace? Is peace all you're interested in? The real war is in us. History is a symptom of our disease.
In a surprise Christmas bombing of Hanoi, President Nixon today delivered more tonnage than was used at Dresden in World War II. It is without doubt the most brutal bombing in American history. Newspapers are calling it a Stone Age tactic, and Nixon a maddened tyrant. Nixon's response, when the Vietnamese take the Paris peace talks seriously, I'll stop.
Change that. Yeah. Monstrous. He butted heads with the intelligence community, and there's interesting things we can point out about that and the way that he was kind of set up afterwards. And I think we can and should have that conversation about Nixon, reevaluating Nixon and his role that he played. But still a monster, still a horrific war criminal. And yeah, I agree, Red Scare. I think the term leftist has lost all meaning. And I think, we've seen throughout the Ukraine crisis, I think how useless that is. And how if you're going to call yourself a leftist and you're pro NATO, I think you're just useless. You're accomplishing nothing. You're actually accomplishing less than nothing. You're actually pulling us in the wrong direction. So yeah, I think it is a useless term as well. Yeah, so that's the thing. So here's China now today. Here's China state propaganda today. Like, I don't think, I know, like, listen, I know just like symbols and iconography don't tell the whole story, obviously. I really don't think though that it's meaningless, that this celebration, this centennial celebration we're looking at, and this sort of iconography and symbolism we're seeing here, I don't think it's meaningless, that this is the country, folks. This is the country that is where all the future is. It's where all the prosperity is. This is the country that has kind of won the global capitalist game. Obviously not yet, because imperialism still exists. America, while on decline, is still very powerful. The game hasn't been won yet, obviously, but in terms of like, this is the new global superpower. This is the country that's developing all of these like countries, these formerly colonized poor countries in the global south, in Latin America and all over Africa. I don't think that's meaningless. Symbols aren't everything, but like I think this is like, people underestimate how powerful this is. That this is the country that is winning the future. How can you not think this is cool? I don't know, Sam. I don't know. Like, there's people, again, talk about leftists. Like, I saw Ben Burgess on Twitter like a few months back, and I had never forgotten about this, being like, you know, trying to like establish some bullshit third position on imperialism, and being like, no serious leftist actually supports the Chinese government, and it's like, no, I actually do support this. Yeah, I actually do support this, and I think it's cool, and I don't apologize for that. I think this actually kicks ass, personally. Folks, this is the dominant global superpower of the next century. Can't stress this enough. What we're seeing right now. This is the dominant global superpower of the next century. This is the dominant global superpower that will be leading global development. All these formerly colonized poor countries. We can't acknowledge that that's a good thing. We can't just accept that like that's an incredible, hopeful, positive thing for the future. You know, like we don't have to just accept losing all the time. You know, we can actually win. We can be on the winning side. And listen, we are heading towards, I don't know if we're going to get there. We're speed running the 20s and 30s right now of the previous century. We're heading towards World War III. I hope to God that that's not where we go, but we're heading towards World War III. That's what the leaders of the United States and Western imperialism, they're determined to start World War III rather than just acknowledge this transition, rather than just acknowledge the emergence of this bipolar world order. And I think if this conflict ever does escalate to that level, again, I hope to God that it doesn't, but if it does, I think you got to be on the right side. Be on the right side of it. It's going to we saw how difficult that can be. We saw a little preview of how difficult that can be in the early stages, especially of the Russia-Ukraine war, escalating like that. We saw how relentless the propaganda is. I mean, like what we saw a couple weeks ago is unlike anything that I've seen since 9/11. The level of propaganda. It makes you feel crazy. We all got a preview of this a couple months ago. It's died down a little, but it makes you feel crazy. You're inundated with it. You're made to feel like you support horrible crimes by not going along with it. You know, it's going to get difficult as well with this as we head towards more conflict with China. But I think it's important to be on the right side of that conflict. You know, it's not going to be easy. But have you thought about these thoughts that the CIA has injected into my brain with the neck plug from The Matrix? That's another element as well, which we can't help. Yeah. But that's what I mean, though. It's like being on the left, being a socialist, regardless of how difficult that is in the West, which is a deeply, deeply anti-communist society, and even with all of our analysis, which obviously as Marxists we have the correct analysis when it comes to the economy, we have the correct analysis, but because when it comes to imperialism, no one wants to listen to us though, because we live in a deeply, deeply, relentlessly anti-communist society where these views are just completely discredited, and people are able to use these kind of like thought terminating epithets about this, like, oh, you support genocide. Is the moment you start talking about these having solidarity with this new global superpower, you say, oh, you've got people you support all these terrible crimes and all this kind of stuff. But that's what I mean, though. It's like people, I think, should look around and accept that, like, that's an amazing, exciting, hopeful thing, that this is where the future is going. That is the global, that China is the global dominant superpower of the next century. You know, that's basically leading the world. It's leading, in all these formerly colonized countries, all these impoverished countries are now starting to work together outside of our purview. You know, that's an incredible, inspiring thing. I can't imagine not supporting that, honestly. I can't. It's the meme of, why are you booing me? I'm right. Exactly. That's what it is to have this analysis. I talk about it all the time, but Kate Jacobson from Alberta Advantage, one time she said, the experience of being on the left is just being proven right constantly about everything and just being always miserable, or something along those lines. I was watching a documentary on the beginnings of World War I earlier. At one point, they explain how Germany, in order to build domestic support for a war against Russia and build credibility for the claim that it was a defensive war, they pumped out propaganda about Russia torturing and killing its own people and all that shit, and it shocks me that people don't see that that's been done for centuries, even down to the same propaganda narratives being repeated today. Seriously, I mean, crybabies, you look into like stuff from the British Empire. Look at what was going on in like India, like the Indian Mutiny, which was, what was that, the 1860s? When is the Indian Mutiny? I want to say 1863, but it might have been later. Okay, it was earlier actually. 1857 and 58. And it's the same kind of thing. Like Britain, we know the horrors of colonization. We know the horrors of the British Empire and the amount of exploitation that was happening with their centuries-long colonization of India. And it's the exact same thing when Indians started to rebel against the British. It was all the exact same excuses. Oh, it's because of Russian propaganda. Literally, word for word, the exact same arguments. This devious Russian propaganda are giving the Indians all these kinds of like ideas about the British Empire and colonialism and all this stuff, and giving them all these ideas about how they need to violently overthrow us. It must be because of the devious Russians that are behind this. It's literally the word for word, the exact same arguments. When you talk about like the evils of colonialism, they're just like, why are you repeating this Russian propaganda? This has literally been used for centuries to discredit any criticism about colonialism or capitalism. It was happening before the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union existed, you had the whole communism thing as a way to say, oh, it's because of communism, but it was never because of that. It was because Russia was outside of that imperialist system, or they were a rival to these imperialist powers. And that's all it was ever about. It wasn't about communism. But literally word for word, all the exact same things about Russian propaganda was what they were saying throughout the Victorian era. I think even anarchists should covet the idea of resisting the negative aspects of a Chinese global hegemony over continuing to languish under the horrors of Western European and American hegemony. China does not have the track record of horror and destabilization. And Matron's Militia, I think that's a good point. And I know our anarchist friends don't agree with some of these things. And if you take a view that just all states are bad, regardless of the state, then you're not going to be happy about seeing these kinds of displays, and you're going to be unsettled or cynical about some of these ideas. I guess that's the point that I try to make when it comes to like global development. And the reality is, I think this speaks to what it means to be like a materialist. Is it just acknowledging the basic reality? There's not a third option. There's not a third option for like global development, for example. You have the Western model under the IMF and Western imperialism, or you have the Belt and Road Initiative. There's not this mysterious third way that these countries can go to access capital investment and build all the infrastructure they need and build up their societies and develop their societies. There's no third option. There's the Chinese model or there's the Western model. And like you talked about, there's a long, long track record of Western colonialism and imperialism, which has just been a fucking nightmare for people. It's a long, murderous, disgusting legacy of violence and exploitation and theft. And China just doesn't have that same record, especially modern China, even with some of the terrible mistakes that they've made in terms of their foreign policy. Especially if you look at literally right now, the IMF model versus the Belt and Road Initiative model. And the way that, China has not been overthrowing other countries. They've not been drone striking other countries. They've not been invading other countries. There's just no comparison. Like I was going into that Tucker Carlson thing the other day. Oh, the Chinese, when they're in charge, they're going to be cruel masters, not like us. They're not going to be the benevolent, heroic world police like the United States were. Like that's absolutely preposterous Western brain colonizer mindset bullshit. The just unmitigated evil that we've overseen, that our societies have overseen as part of this process of exploitation. India and China with brutal histories at the hands of imperialism, even the capitalists of India despise the imperialist system. I mean, that's one of the things we've been talking about lately, Monsieur Balls, Monsieur Balls. I'm sorry. But talking about the ways that countries in the global south are not just immediately backing the United States and using kind of the Russia-Ukraine thing as an example of that. And how India, despite being a loyal Western ally on a number of levels, is being like, no, we're not just going to cut ourselves off from Russia like Europe is doing and just deliberately shoot ourselves in the foot and deliberately tank our own economy just because the United States commanded us to. You can tell that they're very, very familiar with the way that the West has exploited them for generations as well, even if they are a capitalist country, even if they are a country that has a lot of their own problems in terms of their ruling class ideology. But they've at least seen they've displayed that they're not just going to, no matter how much that they've been allies to the West, they're not just going to destroy their own economy because the West commanded them to. Yeah, euro is now below the dollar. Like again, this is going to have massive consequences in Europe when all these like the ruling parties of Europe that have gone along with this are going to get absolutely annihilated. Deservedly so. The fact that global conditions have deteriorated so rapidly post-USSR is a huge indication of how bad our system is. Yeah, and how much the Soviet Union was acting as a dam to kind of prevent that full-on global entrenchment of imperialist dominance, and how as soon as they were gone, it just spread everywhere, and the corruption spread, and everything just started to immediately collapse. If you want to use a wrestling analogy, If you want to use a wrestling analogy, you see how when WWF was competing with WCW, they had to make certain creative decisions that were designed because they were in this constant conflict. And then as soon as WCW was removed, and after WCW was bought out by WWF, they became complacent. They immediately responded right to their old tricks. They lost all their massive audience that they had been able to accumulate. Very similar. The fall of communism with the fall of WCW. I think that's my big wrestling analogy. Life is like a cage match. That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah. Rather than imposing the same humiliation and suffering and torture imposed on them, now that they have the power to do so, they've looked at the world and what it did to them and said, no, we won't do that. If anything, that is more proof than any Western nation has given that China is an international power, can be better trusted with power than the West. I think that's a good way of putting it, crad babes. And again, like I've clashed with people over this kind of stuff as well. I talk not to cause any drama or anything. Like my friend Tyler Shipley, who I think is a wonderful person, great historian, who wrote an absolutely vital book about Canada, settler capitalism. Absolutely integral book that I would recommend everyone read. But he's one of the, I've clashed with Tyler a little bit over China stuff. And he kind of tries to take this stance on this, going like, I take the view, I criticize China from the left and from the perspective of these like Chinese communist dissidents. And it's just like, okay. Personally, I just like, I'm going to just take the side of the 800 million or whatever Chinese Communist Party members that seem pretty okay with how things are going. I'm just going to say, listen, I don't know much. I'm a Westerner. I'm not going to try and lecture you about what is and is not socialism, what does and does not constitute like a socialist project. I don't really feel like it's my place to criticize 800 million Marxists that are in the process of constructing this project and say like, oh no, it's not socialist enough for me. 96 million. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So you can take this stance of like, oh, I stand with these Chinese communist dissidents, but my personal stance is we should stand with like not just people in China, not just like party members in China, but the entire global South who are clearly benefiting from this arrangement, from this new arrangement. This is what get the viewers up, this kind of beef talk. Again, love Tyler Shipley. Wonderful guy, great historian, absolutely essential book. Canada in the World. Highly recommended. Okay, but we have clashed on this very respectfully. We clashed very respectfully about it. But this is my basic stance on this. People see these crazy high approval ratings and then think they must be fudged because people in the West can't comprehend people actually be happy with the direction of their government. Exactly. The idea of a government that like does stuff to help people, that like makes people satisfied, that's completely foreign to some people in our country. So we just assume that if that's what's going on, then it must be bad. By the way, check this out as well. Check this out as well. Did you see this? Retweet if you earn more than President Xi Jinping, leader of the free world. Chinese president, this is from just the other day. Chinese President Xi Jinping and 6 other top Communist Party officials have been given a 62% pay rise, according to state-run media reports. Mr. Xi's basic monthly salary will increase to 11,385 yuan from 7,020 yuan, the China Daily and Wenhuaipo newspaper said. Civil servants will also be receiving their first wage increases since 2006, which will be backdated to 1st October. So his basic monthly salary will increase to 11,385 yuan, or $1,832. $1,832 monthly salary. Look at this capitalist pig. I know. I know. It's so encouraging seeing Chinese students who come to do a year or more at UK universities. They tend to be immune to the propaganda against them and stand firm in the face of all these Western students being like, oh my God, it must be so difficult for you over there. You have like no freedom. And when they reply, actually, it's great, the faux concerned Westerners will suddenly viciously attack them as brainwashed spies and Gestapo wannabes. Yeah. And being the chairman of a party is a ripoff. Chinese teachers earn between 8,500 and 35,000 yuan per month in China. And obviously he has expenses, he has housing and stuff as being the leader of the party, of course, but is still paid like a lower wage than a lot of public servants. If you work in government, don't think about making money. If you want to be rich, then get your money elsewhere. You can't have both. And again, then we have our freedom-loving, democratic, liberal democracy where fucking like every single elected official in the United States is a multimillionaire, right? Maybe save for a handful. And the most prominent public officials are literally like all like multi-hundred millionaire many times over. Engaging in like open corruption and like stock speculation and insider trading, just absolutely open, depraved corruption. Yeah, you literally need millions of dollars to even run, but democracy. And that's exactly what Oliver Stone pointed out when I saw him a few weeks ago, when he was being lectured by this liberal Quebecois journalist about democracy and corruption, remember? We prosecute corruption in these countries. He's just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Best stock trader in history, that Nancy Pelosi. That's right. Chairman Xi is not chasing the bag. He's chasing socialism. This is the point. This is the point. And this is what I want our Western friends to kind of like get on board with this. We can look around at our own culture and be fucking miserable and doomer pilled or whatever about the lack of revolutionary potential in our own societies. Or just like living in this ongoing decline and how fucking horrific it is. And we can and should be cynical about that. That doesn't mean we need to be like completely hopeless about the future. We should actually be filled with hope for the future. And this is the reason. This is the reason we should be filled with hope. And once again, it's not even just about China. It's not even just about defending China or whatever. This is about a vision for global development. It's about a vision for global development. And like I said, there's not three paths for this. There's two paths. There's two sides to this. There's the Western side, the rules-based international order, and there's the Chinese version, which is growing to encompass all of the global south, which is the vast majority of the world's population. These are the two visions. These are the two options for these countries. And we should be celebrating the fact that like they're the ones that are emerging on top in this equation. Like we talked about, all of these US diplomats that are just looking around going, why are these other countries signing on to that Belt and Road Initiative? Why aren't they going with us? It's so strange. It must be because we haven't launched our own properly named Belt and Road competitor yet. And once we launch that, the NATO version, then we'll really start. But no, it's not happening. They've lost already. They've lost it. They've lost Latin America. They lost Africa. No one in Africa has backed them up on Russia and Ukraine. No one. They've got no one there anymore. Very rightfully so. I'm hopeful for the future beyond this coming storm, but I'm not excited for however many years, decades of madness lie ahead. I do think we're witnessing the death of yet another brutal, feudalist nightmare system. Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, that's going to get rough in our own cultures as we have this increasing decline. And we absolutely still should be organizing, of course, getting our analysis out there and doing whatever we can to combat whatever the horrific fallout of this ongoing collapse is going to be. We're already seeing how it's going to metastasize in the U.S. and elsewhere in the West, and it's extremely ugly, and we need to be working to counter that. But beyond the West, beyond the rules-based international order, that's, I think, what gives us reason to be optimistic. Not just like we can work together to fight back against the darkness, but like optimistic that our vision can actually succeed throughout the world. And you never know. You know what? I think one aspect of building socialism in the West is going to be to take advantage of this ongoing collapse, and perhaps even despite all the relentless propaganda, perhaps when things reach a stage of advanced collapse, especially when it comes to infrastructure and people's lifestyles are really being impacted, it will be easier to get people on board with partnering with this country rather than like aiming missiles at them and saying, maybe we should make partnerships with this global superpower and allow them to come in and help fix our crumbling infrastructure and fix our disastrous crumbling healthcare system and come in and start developing our own nations that are being completely decimated by the collapse of this system. I think that's going to be more appealing to people once you see this real decline in like material conditions and living standards. It's going to be easier to make that case to people. Let's not have a war with this country, and let's instead reach a hand out and make partnerships with them and alliances with them. And while maybe that's tricky to sell people on that today, it's going to become easier as this kind of process of collapse continues. Hopefully fix our declining, corrupt, and collapsed government. Exactly. Just get it out of there. Get the whole thing out of there. Got to shatter the propaganda first. Well, that's what we're doing here. That's what we're trying to do here in this community. And Joe's going to pass BBB any moment now. Any moment now, this is going to happen. This could be kind of interesting to take a look at too on this subject. Have we watched VJ's The US Left Does Not Have the Right to Judge Anybody's Speech? I'll copy the link address. We got to get VJ back on this show. Oh, actually, we have seen that speech, but you know what? We can take a look at it again. We have seen that speech before from VJ, but we can take a look again. So this is our friend Aaron Good posted this the other day. Must read from Michael Hudson. The new Cold War is dividing the world into two contrasting economic systems. This is kind of what I was talking about being like, no matter what your level of skepticism is, I think it's important to acknowledge that these are the two options. Like these are the two sides that are emerging here in this global sort of realignment that's happening. And there's no third position, unfortunately. I know it's morally sort of appealing to some people to have this kind of third position here where they don't support anybody, but unfortunately, I just don't think that's a sustainable or like a tenable position to hold. NATO's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia is the catalyst fracturing the world into two opposing spheres with incompatible economic philosophies. China, the country growing most rapidly, treats money and credit as a public utility allocated by government instead of letting the monopoly privilege of credit creation be privatized by banks, leading to them displacing government as economic and social planner. That monetary independence, relying on its own domestic money creation instead of borrowing U.S. electronic dollars and denominating foreign trade and investment in its own currency instead of in dollars, is seen as an existential threat to America's control of the global economy. U.S. neoliberal doctrine calls for history to end by freeing the wealthy classes from a government strong enough to prevent the polarization of wealth and ultimate decline and fall. Imposing trade and financial sanctions against Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries that resist U.S. diplomacy and ultimately military confrontation is how America intends to spread democracy by NATO from Ukraine to the China Sea. The West, in its U.S. neoliberal iteration, seems to be repeating the pattern of Rome's decline and fall. Concentrating wealth in the hands of the 1% has always been the trajectory of Western civilization. It's a result of classical antiquity having taken a wrong track when Greece and Rome allowed the inexorable growth of debt, leading to the expropriation of much of the citizenry and reducing it to bondage to a land-owning creditor oligarchy. That is the dynamic built into the DNA of what is called the West and its security of contracts without any government oversight in the public interest. By stripping away prosperity at home, this dynamic requires a constant reaching out to extract an economic affluence, literally a flowing in at the expense of colonies or debtor countries. The United States, through its new Cold War, is aiming at securing precisely such economic tribute from other countries. The coming conflict may last for perhaps 20 years and will determine what kind of political and economic system the world will have. At issue is more than just U.S. hegemony and its dollarized control of international finance and money creation. Politically, at issue is the idea of democracy that has become a euphemism for an aggressive financial oligarchy seeking to impose itself globally by predatory financial, economic, and political control backed by military force. Oh man, I agreed to read this and it's long, but let's continue. As I have sought to emphasize, oligarchic control of government has been the distinguishing feature of Western civilization ever since classical antiquity, and the key to this control has been the opposition to strong government. That is, civil government strong enough to prevent a creditor oligarchy from emerging and monopolizing control of land and wealth, making itself into a hereditary aristocracy, a rentier class living off land rents, interest, and monopoly privileges that reduce the population at large to austerity. The unipolar, U.S.-centered order hoping to end history reflected a basic economic and political dynamic that has been a characteristic of Western civilization ever since classical Greece and Rome.
You've just become an elite member of the Friendship Triangle.
Set off along a different track from the Near Eastern Matrix in the first millennium BC. Thank you so much, Comrade Social Distancing, for the, oh my goodness, the 10 Tier 1 subs. Oh my goodness gracious, Comrade Social Distancing. Thank you so much. Very, very kind of you. Thank you. Building the productive forces of this show. And I haven't done like a shill segment yet. I will encourage people to subscribe, but first I'm going to continue reading this. So don't interrupt me. No more interruptions. Comrade Social Distancing, I appreciate it. No more interruptions. I'm going to get through this. Then you can subscribe after I'm finished. Ugh. To save themselves from being swept into the whirlpool of economic destruction now engulfing the West, countries in the world's rapidly growing Eurasian core are developing new economic institutions.
You're going to have good old
based on an alternative
to talk you through all this.
Based on an alternative social and economic philosophy.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
With China being the largest and fastest growing economy in the region, its socialist policies...
You've just become an elite member of the Friendship Triangle.
With China being the largest and fastest growing economy in the region, its socialist policies are likely to be influential in shaping this emerging, non-Western financial and trading system. That's kind of why I wanted to watch that like centennial celebration, because it's like, this is the country. This is their part of their philosophy.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
They have a totally different understanding of the role of profit. They have a completely different value system that is explicitly, deliberately, one that is explicitly Marxist. Why is that so hard for people to celebrate?
You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this. You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Instead of the West's privatization of basic economic infrastructure to create private...
use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
Hi Rob, how are you? I am good. Hey chat.
Instead of the West's privatization of basic economic infrastructure...
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Instead of the West's privatization of basic economic infrastructure to create private fortunes through monopoly rent extraction, China keeps this in public hands. Its great advantage over the West is that it treats money and credit as a public utility, to be allocated by government, instead of letting private banks create credit, with debt mounting up without expanding production to raise living standards. China also is keeping health and education, transportation, and communications in public hands to be provided as basic human rights. And again, I'll just keep repeating, this is the country in the future for the next century that is going to be leading global development of all these formerly colonized, impoverished countries. This is something we should celebrate. We should be thrilled about this. We should be thrilled and hopeful and optimistic about this. We should not be sitting around.
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
We should not be sitting around, I think, lecturing this country while we here in the Western left have literally accomplished nothing. We've accomplished nothing in all our decades of organizing and everything that's gone on over the last couple of decades. We've accomplished nothing. And I don't agree with sitting around and lecturing.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Lecturing this other country about this. I think it's chauvinistic. It's chauvinistic. And I think one thing on this show, we've really tried to understand and deprogram ourselves from this like chauvinistic Western viewpoint of everything. Okay? And I think taking this stance where it's,
you can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Sit around here and I'm losing my train of thought. God damn it. China's socialist policy is in many ways a return to basic ideas of resilience that characterized most civilization before classical Greece and Rome. It has created a state strong enough to resist the emergence of a financial oligarchy gaining control of the land and rent-yielding assets. In contrast, today's Western economies are repeating precisely that oligarchic drive that polarized and destroyed the economies of classical Greece and Rome, with the United States serving as the modern analog for Rome. Top Scruffy, thank you very, very much, Top Scruffy, for the 15 months of Tier 1. Thank you, Top Scruffy. Thank you, James Ed Smith, for the gifted sub. Very much appreciated, James. Squatch, thank you so much for the 5 gifted subs. Squatch, you're on thin ice, though, so just keep that in mind. Cursed Sam Cider, thank you for the gifted sub. I very much appreciate that. Carrier Wave, thank you for the gifted sub. Oh, sorry. Thank you for the gifted sub. G Cluppy, thank you for the 200 bits. Alana, thank you for the gifted Tier 1 sub as well. And Alana, thank you for 100 bits as well. Thank you, Alana. Thank you to DRP50 for the gifted sub. And thank you also to Dr. Maggot for the 3 gifted subs. Very much appreciated, Dr. Maggot. Thank you very much. I was really trying to read that and trying to get to like a specific point. I do appreciate the contributions. I appreciate people supporting the channel. I did explicitly request that people just wait a few minutes. I did explicitly request that. I don't see why that couldn't have been respected, but okay, whatever. I do still appreciate it. Thank you to everybody. You blew it, folks. And we have 2.5 minutes left in this hype train. If anyone else wants to contribute, now that I'm doing the delicate task of chastising people while simultaneously encouraging others to subscribe. I respected it, Bob. I'm a good boy. Thank you, Crad Babes. Thank you. Thank you for very respectfully not giving me money.
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
Is now a good time? Yeah, that's okay. Sophisticated Pills. Thank you, Sophisticated Pills, for the 100 friend coin. Do what I request. Okay, authoritarian. Listen, I've got to reassert my dominance here. Obviously, I'm facing a lot of internal internal challenges here in the community. I don't want to name any names. Okay, I don't want to name any names. There's certain individuals that I think are looking at the end of the Rob regime and looking with great interest at the end of the Rob regime and using that as the chaos that's going to ensue from that.
Have good old Rob to talk
as a way to elevate themselves. We don't need to call anyone out in particular about this, but I've obviously got to reassert my control over this community because it's slipping away. But them's the breaks. Thank you very much, Gen X Bushy, for all the support and the gifted sub. Very much appreciated, Gen X Bushy. Thank you. The contradictions are sharpening. Oh my goodness. Jesus Christ, folks. USA subs to Color Revolution Rob. God damn it.
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
This is a test bit alert.
Thank you, Lodane. Thank you. The old heads, real heads now.
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
And thank you, Venus, as well. Am I wrong to think that Chinese economy is not really socialist? It's centralized and industry is mostly state-owned, but the profits is not really distributed to the society. Some of the income is surely used for infrastructure and education. So there's an element of socialism in it, but it's not really close to a real socialist economy where the production is owned by people. Well, I think Lamport, we get into this kind of analysis a lot. And I think people come down on different sides of this. My understanding and my analysis of this, which I've tried to emphasize to people, is to understand the idea of building socialism as being a process, not just like a long process, but a struggle. It's a struggle. It's a long, decades-long period, decades or sometimes centuries-long period of struggle. And like we talked about, when it comes to China opening its economy up to international capitalist development and allowing private capital into the country, in the whole opening up of China that Nixon was responsible for. I mean, I guess you missed, I went on a kind of a rant about this earlier, but I totally understand why I think people were very, very skeptical about that for a long time. But I think over the last 10 or 15 years, as we see President Xi in place now, who's pressing the socialism button, and the pendulum is kind of swinging back to the left in China. And I think a lot of these decisions were necessary because the West had to feel like they had an ally. They had to feel like they had won, that China was just similar to the end of the Soviet Union, that China was being like a sort of junior partner in the global capitalist alliance. And I think that's why a lot of these decisions had to be made in order to allow themselves both the time to develop and also to build the productive forces that have allowed them to transform and modernize their whole society. And I don't think any of that happens. None of that transformation happens without these decisions being made to sort of allow in this capitalist development. So I think if we view it like that, as being this process of struggle, this process that involves contradictions, it involves mistakes. It doesn't mean that it's perfect or that there's no criticism allowed. But I think that's my understanding of it, is that they've made these sort of decisions as part of this process of building socialism. Again, it's not socialism exactly from Marx's description of what communism should be, the kind of classless, stateless society where workers own the means of production. But it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And they're in the process of building a socialist society. And again, this is a process that takes decades. It's of which there's many obstacles to getting to that point. This is my understanding. And this is why I think this is something that we should be supportive of. Ultras malding and China winning. We do see a little bit of that, yeah. Basically, China painted a tunnel on the wall and tricked the U.S. into running into it. That's part of it, yeah. And that's a lot of why America is so lashing out so much now, because they realize that it's like, oh shit. But now it's too late to undo any of these decisions. Now it's too late to like stop the train. This is my understanding of it. Does that make sense? Lamport? This is the editorial line of the Rob Rousseau show when it comes to this subject. It's pretty remarkable how they were able to allow capitalism to build up and industrialize from a feudal society and maintain their communist ideology rather than succumb to capitalist reforms and revisionism. Yeah, and Heroic Skeleton, like, to be clear to our China doubter friends, our non-China enjoyers, I think for a long time, like particularly in the 90s, it was not at all clear that they were going in that direction, that they were maintaining their sort of socialist ideology. I think many people were very, very skeptical about that, and were right to be skeptical. In the 90s, I mean, it was not at all clear that they had maintained this ideology. I think it's really just become clear over the last 10 or 15 years. This is kind of my basic point, is that really the changes of the last 10 or 15 years make all these decisions, which were very controversial, about opening up to capitalism, has made it clarified a lot of these decisions, and you see the logic now that you see this massive transition happening and the absolutely amazing historic levels of development that have happened over the last couple of decades. Massive modern cities just being built from the ground up, massive historic infrastructure projects of high-speed rail and all this stuff. Like, when we're seeing this stuff start to emerge in China, and we're seeing them really deliberately cracking down on this, not just capitalism, but the kind of capitalist ideology. And when they see people that are wealthy, that are that don't have the ideology, that are succumbing to the kind of like upper class bourgeois decadence, they'll crack down on that. And I think in the 90s, it was not at all clear that they were going in direction. And it's really over the last 10 or 15 years that this shift has happened. That has made me, I think, really reevaluate a lot of these things that maybe I would have agreed with a couple years ago. Definitely, my main problem with how the Chinese economy runs is it created an upper class in its own. I don't even care that it's integrated into the global free market system. They can still operate in its current state without enriching a few of those people grossly. Hopefully they started cracking down on that, as we saw with Alibaba. Yeah, I think that's the point, Lamport, is I think what you're describing is a offshoot of these like decisions they made to embrace capitalism to a certain extent as the capitalist mode of production. And it led to like a nouveau riche class, and it really did lead to a lot of that same exploitation that is an inevitable result of capitalism. But I think I'm willing to just see that this shift is happening, and the way that they are pulling the reins of capitalism, and they're making very clear, abundantly clear to capitalists there and around the world that the state is the one pulling the strings, and the state is the one that has the power in their society. So I just think it's a part of a process, right? And that I think, they're currently a few years into this current path of development they're on, which is they're planning to take them to 2040. And so I think we're going to take in 18 years from now, we'll see the development that's happened in China since then. And I think we're going to see even more of a shift in terms of that kind of pendulum. And if it doesn't happen, or if these kind of contradictions continue to emerge, we can criticize this when it happens. But I think it's important to allow that process to play out. And I think it's It's definitely a positive development for people in the global south and countries that want to develop outside the Western system. Like I was saying, and like this Michael Hudson article kind of indicates, there's going to be two global economic systems. There's just the Western version. Now the result of this emerging competing economic system is a hugely positive, important thing to countries that are trying to develop around the world. Yeah, China has a bourgeoisie. Nobody is claiming they have a perfectly formed communist society. Yeah, and no one should claim that. I don't think anyone should think that. And that's what I mean. It's been helpful for me to understand the idea of socialism in this context. And understand there's not like if you want to look at a socialist society, there's not just like a list of indicators and you have to click off every indicator in order to be considered socialist. But the question for me is, are you engaged in this process of building socialism, which is a process, which is a struggle, which requires making sacrifices. It can lead to contradictions. There can be mistakes. You know, that's part of, I think, what being a socialist is today, though, and being an internationalist is not just fetishizing countries like China or saying they're 100% perfect, correct places that are socialist utopias. No one should think that. But what we should do is, show solidarity to countries like China or other countries, whoever else is trying to build socialism, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela or Vietnam or whoever else, and learn from their successes and learn from their mistakes, right? That's what we should be doing, not just condemning because we don't agree with X policy or we personally have this criticism. We should show solidarity to these countries while learning from everything that they've accomplished, and they've accomplished incredible, amazing things, and also learning from the mistakes. That's why socialism is a scientific process. It's a science because it's this constant process of experimentation and finding out what works and making mistakes and learning from mistakes and then building on that knowledge and then passing that knowledge on to other cultures. Right?
To be about China. This is supposed to be about China. Why is he talking about the United States? Because, friends, frankly, the United States does not have the right to judge anybody. The United States does not have the right to judge anybody. And as a subsection of that statement, the US left does not have the right to judge anybody. Because what gives the US left the right to do anything?
We've accomplished nothing. Why are we
only comes after the US left.
We've accomplished nothing, folks. We've accomplished nothing. Why are we lecturing other countries about what socialism is and is not? Why does anyone living in Canada or the US or Britain or Australia or any of these like rules-based international order countries, why does any of us get the fucking nerve to think that we can like lecture people in China or elsewhere about what socialism is and is not? This is what I have a big problem with this.
The US left the right to do anything only comes after the US left builds political power in the United States. First you build power here, then let's talk. Otherwise you're just a college professor. Otherwise you're just a college professor. Or you're somebody who has nothing better to do than go on the internet and harass political forces outside the United States. So that's the first point. Because secondly, it's not just that listen, It's not just that the United States doesn't have the right to judge anybody. Look what the United States is doing. I mean, just think about this. I talked about Code Pink. Code Pink said in 2001, don't go to war in Afghanistan. The only elected official that joined Code Pink was Barbara Lee of California. Every single other member of the United States Congress enthusiastically said, let's go ahead and bomb that shitty country. That's what they said.
Yeah, I would recommend, I would really recommend people watch that whole talk. It's one of the most essential VJ talks. Let me see if I can find it. Is it this? Yeah, it's this. What's the left to do in a world on fire? I would highly recommend people watch this entire talk. And you know what I want to watch now, because it's another VJ Rashad. Let's see if I can find the clip. We've watched it a couple times. In fact, I wish I could remember who it was that posted this clip originally, but this totally fucking, this was a clip that I watched that completely fucking, I felt like reorienting me. Yes, this David Harvey clip.
I mean, David Harvey. Today is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. It's a pretty significant...
I don't want to watch this whole thing, but there's some amazing shit in this.
By your tepid applause, I'm guessing that you have a mixed reaction to the Communist Party of China. Today, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which I direct, has released a report.
Did they fix his mic?
Oh,
Did they fix his mic here?
Well, worse than you, really.
It was off. The mic was off. Leftist audio.
Worse than you. I thought it was all okay. Let me repeat myself. Today's the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, and there we go. That's a much better. And I see you're not clapping. I'm thinking about it. You're thinking about it. Okay.
I love because VJ shows up to David Harvey's book release and just fucking he annihilates everyone. He just absolutely annihilates everyone in the speech. And it's at David Harvey's own book launch. He comes in and just fucking crushes everybody. It's so funny.
That's Michael's problem there. Tricontinental, thetricontinental.org. You can download for free in many languages.
The Lenin shirt too.
A report called "Serve the People."
I gotta get this shirt.
Which was put together by our team in Shanghai, and it's a report on the abolition of extreme poverty in China. 800 million people lifted out of poverty. Now, I was born in India in 1967, a very fine year, 2 years before Ho Chi Minh died. And that's important because yesterday I just finished the introduction to my selected Ho Chi Minh. Friends, I've been working on that book since 1996. Don't make air quotes. It's done now. So it's an incredibly important study. I'd like you to look at it. We released it today as an homage to the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China has done amazing things to lift people out of poverty. Imagine, I grew up in India. India has as many people in extreme poverty today as China has lifted out of extreme poverty. Just imagine that. If you had a choice to be born in China or in India, where would you pick? Unless you were born in the Ambani or Adani family. If you were born in a slum in India or in a working class family in China, where would you choose? It's easy for people in the United States to have this or that criticism of China, but you don't understand what it means to be born in a country that had been colonized and lived with a wretched old culture. You just don't get it, guys. You live on the other side of imperialism. I'm going to come back to that in a minute.
We live on the other side of imperialism.
I read this book with a great deal of enjoyment. One of the reasons I really enjoyed it is this has, in a very conversational way, all the major themes of David Harvey's work since the 1960s. It has.
It's funny too because he compliments the book because it's David Harvey's book launch. He compliments it while giving this like 20-minute long constructive criticism about that completely annihilates everybody.
Is really gripping sense of what urbanism is to capitalism. It has his fascination, and he says it, a term he likes, spatial fix. It has the spatial fix explained, I think, as clearly as you'll get in any of his other texts. But more importantly, the chapter on accumulation by dispossession, which I didn't know was a term that came from Arrighi, is an incredibly useful summary of this vital concept of accumulation by dispossession. It has these in a very conversational way. This is an incredibly useful book. And David, thanks for doing it, honestly. Chris is the better judge than you.
What a guy.
Of anything that you do, David. Anything that you do. Just listen to Chris. Not only does Chris put your mic on, thanks, Leanne. Thanks a lot. But it's a really good book for that, because it puts together for you, I would say, some of the principal things that have detained David over the course of these last decades. So I think it's really vital, it's important, and you know how important David's work is, so I'm not going to spend time in going over that. Instead, of course, I'm going to talk about what preoccupies me and what I didn't see in the book, David. So in that sense, it's really about me now, which, I'm sorry, guys, you came to hear about David, but this section is about me. There are three things I'd like to talk about, which I think are pretty important. One of them is, of course, David has been for a while in a debate, a public debate, with Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik and with John Smith on the question of imperialism. And it is striking, though, reading the book,
needs a theory.
How imperialism doesn't really come in except in the margins. It's not a structuring concept. And I would like David to talk a little bit, because I know David thinks about these things greatly. How do we really understand the fact that the United States spends more on its military force than any country on the planet, and then, more than the next, I think, 9 or 10 countries in the world? Why are there so many US bases? How are we to understand the hybrid war that the United States prosecutes against Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Syria, you name it, friends, including, of course, China? David has a very interesting perspective on why the United States is going after China, which I completely agree with. There's a question of technology, the question of capital-intensive production. 100% agree with the argument. But where is the concept of imperialism in this? I would like David to reflect on that for us. I'm not really that interested in the debate with the Patna.
David, think about why you didn't include the theory of imperialism in this book. David, sit down and think about why you didn't include that. How about that? The book's wonderful. Oh, yeah, it's great. I love the book. It's wonderful. You're brilliant. Why is there no imperialism in the book? Maybe you should reflect on that, David.
And with John Smith, because I think that's a different kind
he's white.
of question, David, that they have raised. It's at
likelihood.
A different level.
It doesn't care about imperialism.
Thinking about some of these issues of why
what
it is
VJ
that
mean
certain
with hybrid war? Yeah, it's like sanctions undermining. It's like hybrid war is what you see the U.S. waging, especially like we were talking about yesterday in the whole like Arab Spring countries, in Syria and Libya, hybrid warfare, like sanctions, economic warfare, destabilization efforts, arming militant groups, color revolutions, that kind of stuff.
Countries can't or shouldn't be allowed to move from labor-intensive production to capital-intensive production. What are extra economic pressures to be called other than imperialism? China is not asking the United States to stop doing capital-intensive production. So China, in that sense, is not being imperialist against the United States.
I can't even fathom writing a whole book on capitalism without acknowledging imperialism. Like it's literally a correct theory. How can you just discard it? Because Lenin was mean or something. Yeah, and Vijay does not let this go. He does not let this go. As much as he tries to be kind to Harvey, it's literally a segment promoting Harvey's book. But Vijay absolutely fucking roasts him over his exclusion of this concept in his analysis.
There are no Chinese warships off the coast of New York
About
City.
10
the
plus
last time
fronts
I
in the
looked.
China hybrid
There's
war,
plenty
for sure.
of U.S. warships, and now
I mean, like what I was just saying before, because they're so economically entangled because of these decisions that were made in the late 70s and early 80s in China, because of the way they're so economically inseparable, it makes it much more difficult for the U.S. to wage hybrid war. That doesn't mean they don't do it, though. That's exactly what I think this whole this Uyghur Forced Labor Act is, right? It's a way to just sanction China without saying we're sanctioning China. It's about using this human rights facade to engage in economic warfare in Xinjiang and trying to destabilize Xinjiang, making sure people, Uyghurs or whoever else lives in Xinjiang, don't have access to the same kind of opportunities because they're pressuring companies to not do business with them, right? So that's part of their hybrid warfare against China. Because they're so enmeshed with China, they can't call it sanctions, but that's what it is. That's what the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act is. It's not about protecting human rights, obviously, because it's being done by the fucking United States government. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything about trying to economically destabilize this region of China, and which allows them to get their fucking greasy little fingers in there and trying to, exert their influence that way. That's one front of the hybrid war.
one unfortunate bedraggled British warship, when did they begin
They came to BDS, though,
the
of course.
HMS
Yeah.
of all
No,
things,
no.
Queen Elizabeth. I mean, for God's sake, she's still alive. The HMS Queen Elizabeth sailing off half the crew has COVID. I mean, it's a miserable. It's like the opium war on acid. I don't understand what the British are doing. They have a country that's falling apart, and yet they've decided they've got to go poke the Chinese. For what reason?
Because the United States told them to. The exact reason that all of Western Europe is committing economic suicide right now because of U.S. imperialism. Stop oppressing the people. We're taking every job out of the region so you can stop oppressing them. No jobs for the oppressed. It's really interesting, God's own drunk, like looking at companies like Skechers who rely on labor coming from Xinjiang, who literally have Skechers put out a statement that was like, we're concerned about this. We want to ensure that there's no forced labor happening. So we've done our due diligence. We've gone in and inspected all these places just to make sure we can be absolutely certain that there's no human rights violations or forced labor taking place, and nothing like that was going on. And they've deliberately said these things, and then they get accused of just being like China sympathizing, whatever, tankies. The tanky company of Skechers. That's what they get accused of. Same kind of thing. Aren't the majority of labor violations glorified in West media come from Taiwan? You're probably right. And it's this kind of forced labor is the fucking building block of neoliberalism that the United States has not only relied on, like extremely low paid, low wage, no benefit foreign labor in Taiwan, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and Bangladesh. That's the building blocks of neoliberalism. Not only have they relied on this kind of exploitative labor, they've literally enforced that economic system at gunpoint in these countries to ensure that they had access to that cheap labor, and that anytime any labor movement in a colonized country or a neo-colonial country, anytime any labor movement started trying to organize for worker protections or rights, the United States would go in and fucking overthrow the government or, fund right-wing death squads to go and murder these organizers. This is what the U.S. has been doing. This is what Western imperialism has been doing around the world for decades. So the idea that they care at all about anyone's human rights or about this idea of forced labor, especially considering not just around the world, but in the United States, in the fucking vast United States depraved, torturous prison system that literally is a vast source of forced labor and basically modern slavery. That's happening in the United States. So to say nothing of what's going on in the global South, in kind of friendly colonized countries of the U.S. The idea that they care at all about human rights or forced labor or any of that stuff. It's just preposterous on its face.
So the first set of considerations, I think, is to raise the question, is it important to have the concept imperialism somehow appear in the text? And I wonder how it would appear, if not grounded in the material structure of this prevention of the shift from labor-intensive production to capital-intensive production. The second set of considerations, I'm very interested in the Leninist break. And by the way, I didn't plan to wear this T-shirt, okay? It's just that I grab a T-shirt off the shelf and put it on. Okay, I'm not like that. I would have worn a Ho Chi Minh T-shirt to celebrate the final completion of the book, but no.
Honestly, it's very telling that even MSN, like CBS, seems to only mention this humanitarian crisis in passing because they don't have anything to back it up. I mean, literally, I've got people in my own Twitter mentions now for every fucking thing that I post, people like accusing me of doing genocide denial for my comments about this kind of stuff. But like the reality is, and I don't want to go down this whole rabbit hole because I want to watch this video. As I've said many times, I'm simply, my basic stance on this is that I'm extremely skeptical about any claims about human rights that are coming from the Victims of Communism Foundation, that are coming from think tanks backed by the weapons manufacturing and backed by Western imperialists, or any of these like NED-aligned human rights groups. I simply am skeptical about any information about this human rights disaster that comes from these groups that are linked to and funded by the United States government. That's my big controversial tanky stance about this, is that we should be highly skeptical when our government, who clearly we know from studying imperialism, our government, which does not respect human rights, we don't respect human rights domestically with poor people, with women, with transgender or people or other people in the LGBTQIA community, or indigenous people. Any immigrants, refugees, people of color. We don't respect human rights here. So I'm extremely skeptical for that reason when people in our government start lecturing and wagging their finger about human rights violations in official enemy states, which are coincidentally right on the verge of suppressing them as a global economic superpower. So on a number of levels, I'm very skeptical about these claims when they start being made. I don't think our governments have credibility to be lecturing about human rights. And all this information that's coming out is if it's linked to the United States government, the intelligence community, or the weapons manufacturers, I simply do not believe it. And that's my big extremist radical stance that enrages people, I guess, sometimes about this. But I'm not going to deviate from that.
I wore this old Lenin shirt. The Leninist consideration to me is important. It's very interesting that in all the texts on Western Marxism, Lenin gets skipped. If you look at, say, Perry Anderson's considerable, survey of Western Marxism, and he does it twice, by the way. He has 2 books on it. In both books...
I'm just going to quickly go to the bathroom and let this play, folks, okay? I'm not doing a break today. I'm going all the way through, not taking a break, just quickly going to the bathroom. I'm just acknowledging that so you understand these sort of sacrifices that I make to bring you this kind of content.
Lenin doesn't figure. He jumps from the second international thinkers over them to Gramsci or to Karl Koch or to, let's say, some of the more significant French figures. They skip Lenin, and I think that's significant. Ho Chi Minh doesn't skip Lenin. Lenin is, in fact, the beginning for them. Lenin is the beginning because what Lenin says is if you come from a colonized part of the world, the productive forces will not be developed for you there. Imperialism will not develop the productive forces. Therefore, you have to have a dual agenda, which Marx didn't think about. That's why Gramsci celebrated the Soviet Revolution as a revolt against capital. The book Capital, in fact. This is a revolt against the book. We need to take that seriously. We shouldn't duck that. What Lenin argued in the thesis to the Comintern 1920, which Ho Chi Minh reads in L'Humanité and says, my God, the sun came out in the sky for me. I never read anything like this. What that Leninist breakthrough suggests is that we have to consider that you've got to push an anti-colonial national liberation strategy simultaneously with the socialist revolution, simultaneously with the social revolution, land reform and so on. You've got to move there. And we have to build the productive forces because, we can't wait for 1,000 years. And anyway, imperialism is never going to allow us to build the productive forces. So we've got to have this breakthrough. Consideration of that Leninist moment, I think, helps us understand so much of what Marxism does outside North Atlantic states. And I think that's another area, of consideration. If we neglect Lenin, I think we neglect that seam of Marxism that is developed outside the North Atlantic.
There's a very specific reason that Lenin is skipped, And again, when we talk about like the compatible left, our academic Marxist friends, there's a reason that Lenin gets skipped, because once you have that analysis, it becomes very tricky to, I think, maintain that kind of squishy middle position, that squishy third position about, what is to be done.
In his introduction to the Verso edition of Ho Chi Minh, says he's not a theorist. I take great objection to that. This view that theorists are only, in the academy in the West, whereas Ho Chi Minh or Mao are not theorists. Read them carefully, you will find a theory there. Isn't that what Gramsci said? Elaboration, elaborate theory out of practice. That's the obligation of the new intellectual. So the second set of considerations, I think, is where is Lenin in our thinking? Where is this Leninist moment, which actually is very important for 90% of the Marxists in the world, if not more. So that's the second set of considerations. The third set of considerations is what's the post-capitalist future? And, I have to say, David, I read the first chapter and I stopped myself because I said, I'm reading this wrong. And in fact, I read right through and I was talking to Chris about it. But by the time I got to the last chapter, I realized that there is an issue here that I would like you to, clarify. In the first chapter, David talks about how capitalism is too big to fail. And that's an interesting issue because this raises the question of socialism. I think David is right in one sense that a post-capitalist situation today on a global scale, in other words, what used to be called in the communist international literature, the world revolution, is not going to happen in our time, perhaps, okay? We never know what happens, I mean, imagine, do you think that the Russians sitting in Switzerland, like Lenin, thought there'd be a revolution in the largest country in the world? I don't think they thought that. Not at Zimmerwald. They certainly didn't think that at Zimmerwald. That was only 2.5 years before a revolution breaks out.
I think that's always the amazing story to remember as well about the Russian Revolution, and how I talked before about how little revolutionary potential we might have in the West, and maybe all that is true. Always very important to remember, though, that that's the quote, right? It's impossible to imagine more. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I think as hopeless as it can feel sometimes, and I completely get that, it also felt hopeless. I'm sure it felt very, very hopeless for those like right prior to these incredible revolutionary moments. Was teaching in Zurich at the beginning of 1917. Yeah, exactly.
So God knows what's going to happen, friends. We are living in a permanent COVID catastrophe. The way in which people are piss mad about the world as it is, we don't know what's going to happen. But I take the point that advanced capitalism is so sophisticated right now. It's so integrated. Labor is so socialized. It's difficult to imagine properly the possibility of making socialism or even a socialist experiment in one country. Look at how the experiments are being sanctioned, the blockades and so on. These are firm and difficult. I take that point. On the other hand, I wonder very much if it's too big to fail, because in a way, capitalism is a failure. For most people, it is actually existential failure already. So it's not a question of we will starve in the future if we break down capitalism. We are already starving. 2 to 3 billion people on the planet are already in starvation. So I'm thinking about this post-capitalist issue. I think we should think about it quite seriously. For me, the post-capitalist moment has to be understood now. We can't suspend it till later. Now, I take very seriously the line in the German ideology where Marx and Engels write that, look, guys, don't be idealists, okay? Communism isn't something that you impose outside into the world. Communism is the real movement of history. It's a very important section of the German ideology. I've never really understood Althusser. I tried my best to read it. I never really picked up on the young Marx, old Marx. I just see a thinker trying to understand things, and he makes changes all the time in his life. It's not like young Marx and old Marx is enough. Marx is constantly changing. Even in the so-called old Marx, as David says, in this book, while he's writing Capital 1, he's already writing Capital 3. So David very carefully and cleverly says, when he's talking about rate and mass, he has a question he raises, the answer is in Capital 3, because he's noting that down over there. Marx is always changing, always thinking, young, old, I'm not sure. But certainly, in the German ideology, this is a significant point. That
I got to interrupt this less because I'm running low on time.
Our views onto the world. It doesn't work like that. We have to look at the real motion of history. And in a sense, the real movement of history requires us to look at places like China, look at what they are doing, understand what are the experiments. Let's understand what's happening in Vietnamese public health. How is it that in Vietnam, they had such a low COVID fatality rate? How is that? Because they have an extraordinarily good public health system, which was praised in 1978 at the Alma Ata meeting of the World Health Organization. And they absorbed traditional Vietnamese medicine into modern medicine in the same way as the Chinese absorbed Chinese medicine into modern medicine. They didn't neglect it or laugh at it, etc. They were clever. And they built a structure of rural medicine. You see, I'm going to say a few things and then I'll end there, Chris. I know you told me speak as much as you want. It's a dangerous business. But what I want to say is, these countries, as part of the Leninist project.
What always comes up whenever we watch this clip or whenever we watch VJ, it's just learning how to be an effective communicator, right? It's really a skill that is so few people are able to have. That's why we gravitate to people like VJ. It's why we gravitate to Parenti. The idea, and someone I think it was Cradbibs that just mentioned, Lenin had this ability to not sound pretentious or academic when you describe these concepts to people. And I'm so in awe of his ability, of his communication ability. And it's really something that I've tried to, a lot of these figures, right? It's really something that I try to bring to the work that I do here on this channel and elsewhere. Is being able to communicate ideas like this to people.
Because they understood the worker-peasant alliance. And you can't write about the world today without agriculture. The worker-peasant alliance, they
demolishing this guy with not being an asshole.
Different forms of land reform in an early way. Now, it's true in Vietnam, North Vietnam in particular, 53 they had land reform.
Yeah, totally low, Dave.
By 56 they were criticizing themselves, very severely. I'm not interested in the criticism. What I'm interested in is what they don't talk about. When you go after landlordism, you create the possibility in a rural area to create collective structures of social welfare. See, this is something you don't think about if you don't understand rural areas. When landlords have a grip on rural society, they don't permit collective structures of social welfare to be built because they create patron-client relations. I know this fundamentally from looking at caste structures in India. Landlords don't want caste to be attacked because caste for them is a mechanism of social control, and they want to be the ones who provide social goods when there's a catastrophe. When you get rid of the landlords, as they did in Vietnam after 53, you can create collective structures of social welfare, and that's what you see in Vietnam today. I have traveled in rural Vietnam, and you get to see there this incredible sense of rural social welfare institutions that provide health and education and retirement schemes. David makes a really good point about how pensions are being stolen in the West. It's not happening in those countries because pension structures are rooted in these collective structures in rural areas. Got to look at those as well. The whole world is not identical to the West. That's something I want you to think about. Agrarian parts of the world are fighting deep struggles to defeat landlordism. That's got to be the center of our focus. Most people in the world today are still living most people in the world in Asia are still living in rural areas. That fight is the key fight. So I made 3 points, David. I hope those were pretty clear in my own way, rambling,
It's in the question and answer period that he really goes off, though.
Non-properly
he takes some more questions after.
Scholastic way. But these are things
and
I said
get
from
to the point
heart.
that I was
David
mentioning
Harvey is
earlier.
somebody that I like to think with a lot. This is an important book, and I'm really proud and happy to share this moment, David, to say,
oh yeah, the book was
people,
great.
Please read this.
Good job.
It's going to help you. If you've never read David Harvey, this is a really good introduction. Thanks a lot.
I thought it was really important that we sit more with the questions of imperialism, because if we don't, then the questions of capital, it's complete, you're going to go down.
Here's where
it was Stalin
who really
who said
goes
something along
off.
the lines, of like, theory, practice, theory without practice goes nowhere, and practice without theory gropes in the dark. We have to understand, the way that these different concepts are interconnected, and if we don't, centralize
teacher knows how to give a C-.
then especially China, you're never gonna, I feel like it's just going to be a dead-end circle trying to understand how they're acting, because everything about China is in response, the collapse of the USSR is in response to American imperialism. I mean, I wouldn't go that far at the USSR, but
You can't understand how
again,
the world is
American
without
imperialism,
understanding what
I think, is just a really
imperialism
central
is.
question. I wanted to sit with it. Sorry.
Let me just come in with that, if that's okay. I mean, for me, imperialism is not a set of rhetorics. It's understanding a structure, a real structure in the world. I've actually never understood imperialism to prevent industrialization. It's about control of, let me put it another way. Just before he died, I talked to Samir Amin, who was a dear friend of mine and a great teacher and a person who understood things in his own way. And we had many disagreements, not the least of which about Egypt, with which he had his own views. But he's Egyptian, and nowadays in the United States, people say, let's hear from an Egyptian, as if that's somehow more credible, this idea, like, I get this sometimes, people say, we want to hear from a Syrian. Which one? Who? Like, what class background and so on. But, there is this sort of populism that has taken over people's imagination. I can introduce you to lots of terrible Palestinians, that are willing to collude and cooperate with the Israeli apartheid Zionist project and with US imperialism. Lots of Indians, including Narendra Modi, grotesque, and so on. Let's hear from an Indian. Let's bring Narendra Modi to speak to you.
And that's kind of what I was saying before when you talk about these human rights concerns as well, where this is the kind of the argument that gets made. You try to point out the very obvious, what I think is an obvious truth, that we should support the rise of this multipolarity. We should support the rise of a emergent economic power to the United States that has these different values, this different vision for development. That's something we should support. And people say, well, but listen to this, listen to one of these dissidents, listen to a dissident from Hong Kong, listen to this Tibetan dissident. You've got to listen to someone from one of these groups. And it's like, well, okay, but you're telling me to listen. They always want to listen to dissidents. Yeah, listen to who? Listen to these Ned-backed official dissident groups that are sponsored by these American Western think tanks and American intelligence institutions. That seems to be every single time this argument about human rights gets brought up. This is the exact way this argument is framed. Well, you're just this arrogant Westerner, and you're not listening to this oppressed group, this oppressed dissident group. And it's obviously it's not about China; it's about every single state enemy. It's the exact same thing. Well, listen to the Venezuelan. Listen to this, my friend. We talk about the fall. Whenever we talk about communism, we've always got that friend. My friend escaped communism. Listen to them. Listen to my Venezuelan friend. Listen to my Nicaraguan friend. Listen to my friend from Eastern Europe, my Romanian friend. They've all got these horror stories. You got to listen to them. But who we've got to choose who. It doesn't mean it's not just this thought terminating argument. I think to point out these dissident groups, we have to ask about the class characteristics and why these dissident groups are dissident groups. Are they connected to these things? think tanks or intelligence interests. Like these are really important things we need to ask ourselves. Yeah. Anyway, let's go back to that. I always think that's a really interesting point, though. And again, upcoming is where he really kind of goes off and really gets into the crux of the point that I was making earlier about the idea of why I think it's important to show solidarity with China or any other country that is trying to walk this, follow this socialist path and is trying to, in their own way, with their own context, their own cultural context, trying to build this socialist system. And why I think it's important that we show these projects basic solidarity. Vijay is going to really speak to this in a few moments.
Yes. So I'm actually not interested in the idea of imperialism as a set of rhetorics. Obviously, these are serious issues of structure. And yes, of course, capitalism will seek out places where industrialization can take place and so on. But there are certain aspects of control.
Yes, Dave.
This was the conversation with Samir. He said there are 5 or 6 areas of control which are, where there's no permission to export these things. One of them is science and technology. And I mean, David makes a lot about the refusal to allow capital intensive to go to certain places. Another one is financial systems. Control over financial systems is maintained. Control over arms and who gets to be the top dog militarily.
They fund NGOs, dissidents who are Westerners funding local dissidents and cause color revs in other countries. Examples: Syria, Sri Lanka, Tiananmen, Hong Kong, Cuba, recently Venezuela, Bolivia, etc. There's also the whole reality that, like, in our immigration system, if you live in Canada or the United States, if you are a member of like a communist party, you're explicitly banned from immigrating to these countries. Like the people that legally immigrate explicitly, like if we don't allow it to happen for like people that were socialists, that were part of socialist countries. They're not allowed. So literally the only immigrants that we accept from these countries are dissidents to the system, are non-socialists that of course are going to come here and are going to have, what do you know? They're going to have horror stories about the horrible atrocities that they escaped from. Like we got our Romanian friend or whatever in the chat the other day that was doing this. That's the whole purpose of having that as your immigration policy, is exactly for that reason. That's exactly the reason that Canada, as I've pointed out a number of times, has this huge, like very right-wing Ukrainian nationalist diaspora, because we specifically imported, thousands of fascists, like actual fascists and fascist collaborators and sympathizers following the war, imported them into our Ukrainian community for this express purpose, which we're seeing the results of to this day. So it's like, this is every single time we want to try to show basic solidarity to these countries, this is how it gets shut down. But like, it's explicitly built into our education system and our immigration system and our media to be just constantly, only hearing from groups that have this complaint and that are, dissidents and are just this source of just horror stories and about these societies. And this is what gets used to kind of delegitimize our ability to support these countries. And this is why we have to do our best to ignore all those efforts, as difficult as it can be sometimes. It's being that these kind of efforts are happening for a very specific reason. So we have to be able to like kind of push through that, because it can be very effective. This kind of like human rights horror stories. We see with our own friends and family how effective this method can be of turning people against these countries. We'll hear it from our own people that we know. Like we log on to Facebook or wherever, we'll see all kinds of this stuff. That's why I think it's really important to recognize this specific tactic. And we have to be able to sort of allow that to move beyond that.
Maintained, these so-called freedom of navigation exercises, control over communications, the information war. Just look at the internet.
About this in Russia-Ukraine context.
This is a Chinese government website. When are you going to say this is funded by the US government? 90% of NGOs funded by the US government. You'll never get that on YouTube or Google or anything. Funded by the Russian government. This is information war. It's to delegitimize these sources of information. Now, I'm not saying they're all great, but that's not the point I'm making. The point is who gets to define things, How do you define what's happening to Venezuela? How do you define what's happening to Cuba? January 11th, okay, something happens in the morning. Miguel Diaz-Canel, president of Cuba, gets into a car in Havana, drives to San Agustin de los Baños, walks among the people and says, what's your... Have you ever seen a US president get into a car and go and talk to protesters? Every day, 3 people are killed in the United States by the police. Where is SOS USA? Never. But yes, there's SOS Cuba. This is an information war, guys. This is control over information. Imperialism isn't a set of rhetorics. It's about the fact that there are these capillaries of control over certain aspects. Finance is a huge element in this. The SWIFT system, the ability to access capital through the IMF. I'll give you a little story. The head of the IMF, a very decent person, Georgieva, she made a statement saying during the pandemic we're going to release capital to countries that are struggling, that need to help their healthcare systems and so on. On the IMF website, it said that the representative from the government of Venezuela in the IMF, and it named a person who is a government official of the government of Nicolas Maduro. So the IMF got a request from the government of Venezuela for funding, for their own money, by the way, just to let you know, a share of their own money. The IMF refused the money. So I called...
Inside, you say it does show you state media on PBS's YouTube channel. That's the trick, though, right? Is that I think we allow ourselves, because there's this degree of separation between the state and these private media companies, we don't view them as being state media to the same extent. But we've seen time and time again how these mainstream media companies are tools of U.S. imperialism, and the social media companies as well. Like now, social media companies are massive media companies in and of themselves. They're all being staffed by like United States State Department and intelligence people, and they're all like, literally engaging in disinformation efforts that are explicitly guided by U.S. government propaganda. It's like we might label PBS as a state media, but I think we don't really label the way that we're constantly being inundated with information that's explicitly coming from this pro-Western, pro-America, pro-capitalist perspective. I got to try and get through this. We're getting to the really good part too soon.
Called the IMF and I said, what about this? You've got on your own website the name of an official, and you're saying that the actual government of Venezuela is in contest only by the United States, Britain, and half a dozen, formerly colonial countries or imperialist countries, whatever. A day later, this government official's name disappeared from the website. They disappeared the name. Now, talk about Stalinism and airbrushing. They just removed the person from the website. This is what I called the person again.
That would actually be a good audio drop as well. Stalinism. That's very good.
They told me, and I'm speaking to you on the record, they told me that the U.S. Treasury Department is not happy with the U.S. Treasury. What do they have to do with the IMF? You see, so it's control over financial systems. This is imperialism.
This is kind of the point. This is kind of the point that he's making. It's not just about PBS. It's about that as these Western powerful interests have control of these vast capillaries of control, as he describes it, which don't get labeled, and people that grow up in this society don't recognize it as being state propaganda the way we recognize what we would consider to be state propaganda in other countries.
Better term to explain this. I'm not wedded to the rhetorics of, I'm not interested in standing at a square and yelling and screaming and fulminating and protecting my bourgeoisie. I would like my bourgeoisie to drown in its own spit. I don't care about that. That's not the theory. The theory has to manifestly understand these capillaries of control. You can use any other word if you want to give me a postmodern word. I'll take it into consideration, but you don't have a better word for it. Give me a better theory and I'll absorb it. And I'll tell you, this give me a better theory business comes from a Tony Kushner play. Tony Kushner wrote a terrific play called Angels in America. I don't know if you've seen the second part called Perestroika, where Ante-Deluvievich comes to the stage. He's the oldest living Bolshevik. You remember this? Ante-Deluvievich comes and he says, you NEP men, he's yelling at the Gorbachev people, you NEP men, you little snakes. He said, even a snake, he said, before it gives up its skin, grows another one.
And so how much is this state propaganda versus corporate propaganda? Well, I think what you see in the West is you see this like kind of symbiotic relationship with private capital and with the state, right? In many cases, you have the state this is the whole issue when we talk about capitalism in the West versus like socialism with Chinese characteristics. Obviously, the Chinese rely on capitalism as a like model of development, but the difference is, I think, in the West, you have capital, which is ultimately the ultimate power in our culture, and the state is subservient to that, where in China, it is the reverse. And so when it comes to mainstream media, like all of mainstream media is all funded by the defense contractors and, various other massive corporations, as you point out. But they're also doing the bidding of the specific vision of the official government, sort of U.S. State Department policy when it comes to sort of these foreign policy geopolitical affairs. So it's this kind of symbiote, like this blob of capital and the state that are both kind of like serving their own interests in the same moment. But these things are it's inseparable. Like the idea of corporate propaganda, like the corporate propaganda is state propaganda and vice versa. I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
He said, I want a theory. Give me a theory. You've rejected our theory. Even a snake, before it gives up its skin, grows anew. What is your theory? You don't have a theory. You are just going to wither in the sunlight. So if you give me a better theory than the theory of imperialism, I'll adopt it. But you don't have one. And what I find interesting in David's book is all the elements of the theory are there. For instance, the suffocation of certain parts of the world, and they are, in fact, certain parts of the world that are not permitted to move to capital intensive. Bangladesh, for instance. Why cannot Bangladesh move? And David, you make a lot of Bangladesh. Why can't Bangladesh move from labor-intensive production in the garment sector to capital-intensive? Is it a demographic problem? I don't think so. Yes, it's the domestic bourgeoisie in Bangladesh is ridiculously horrible. We would like to overthrow them. But is that the only problem? Are there other problems? Is there a lack of capital? How will they access capital to make the move to capital intensive and so on? See, Xinjiang, for instance, much in the news for other reasons, is basically capital intensive agriculture. David.
Okay, so you seem to be sort of like, I think your exact viewpoint that you have here, talking about communism in China and Cuba, if you want actual communists, I think this is exactly the notion I've been trying to dispel for most of the time that I've been on Twitch, and especially today. So I think you need to be, if you have that's your mindset. I'm not going to get into a big argument with you because I got to go soon. But try to keep your mind open with this next segment here. Okay. That's all I would ask from you, because that's what you've just kind of expressed is the exact mindset that I'm kind of explicitly trying to reject here.
One of the interesting features of this is I would like to send a subpoena to John Deere Corporation in Illinois, because John Deere has exported more farm equipment to Xinjiang province than any other company. Why are they silent when all this stuff is going on about slave labor in Xinjiang? Why doesn't John Deere come on the record and say, yes, but by the way, we also exported all these tractors and combine harvesters? How do you have this massive export of combine harvesters and slave labor in the same, Yes, because you have a fanatical, anti-Semitic Christian evangelic by the name of Adrian Zench, who came on Democracy Now! To talk about lies. Okay, that's what you have. That's control over information and communication systems. And that, you need a theory to explain that. And for me, that theory is imperialism. So just taking up from your views and so on, I agree with you. We need a theory. Give me a better theory, I'll adopt it. Until I get a better theory, this one is pretty good to me. What do we do? Well, 30 years ago,
Okay, here we go.
I joined the Communist Party of India Marxist.
This was I think this was the segment that I really wanted to look at when I opened this clip, but I'm glad that we've watched the whole thing anyways, because I think this is just such a legendary clip that I think backs up a lot of the sort of arguments we were making earlier.
30 years ago. Imagine this. The Soviet Union was collapsing and I joined the Communist Party. That's how intelligent I am. I wouldn't have changed anything because I believe, my friend, you have to do things.
Like start a Twitch
there's no
stream.
blueprint that comes at you.
Counts.
There's no theory that comes at you. There's no leadership that's in front of you
That
is
counts.
clairvoyant. Lenin in one of his texts says that if you're not willing to make mistakes, you'll do nothing. If you're not willing to make mistakes, you'll do nothing. You have to do things. You have to get involved in things. You have to try to euthanize the landlords. You have to do something. You have to get involved with other people. The point of struggle is to be involved with other people, not to have the correct ideas. You see, it's very easy to develop the correct ideas. We have in this country at least a civilization of grad students who each have the correct idea. But if you don't join together and build movements where you build it in compassion with each other, where you understand that you're not perfect, you're trying to build perfection. And not even perfection, you're trying to, what's that word, asymptotically attain perfection. Like a railway line, which looks like an infinity, it joins. As you keep walking, it keeps looking as if it's not joined. That's the nature of contradictions. You think you want utopia to emerge. If you don't want utopia, you wouldn't do shit. We are motivated by the desire for utopia. You got to do something. You got to get involved. You can't just say, what can I do? You just got to go and do. And then in doing, you'll experience things and you'll grow and you'll learn how to deal with other people. The most important thing in politics, by the way, isn't having the correct program. It's learning to be not an asshole. Learning to be in your cell meeting and learning with other people and figuring out how to talk to each other. Having the correct program, it's people. The most important thing in politics, by the way, isn't having the correct program. It's learning to be not an asshole. Learning to be in your cell meeting and learning with other people and figuring out how to talk to each other and just being a decent person as you try to model decency in the world. We're trying to model decency and honesty. That's what we're really trying to model. If Marxists are actually honest with each other, that's really what we're going for when we build movements. We want decency, honesty. We want you to go out in front of people. One of the reasons I love Ho Chi Minh is he keeps talking about that. Don't be bureaucratic. Don't be commandist. Don't tell people what to do. I'm not telling you anything to do. I'm just telling you, you got to experience the world. You can't experience the world in the pages of a book alone. There is no revolutionary theory without revolutionary practice. But by the way, that's
and you
a
can do a
vice
Twitch
versa
stream as well,
statement.
which counts.
There's no practice without the theory either. And by the way, Lenin didn't finish the sentence. And that quotation comes from What Is to Be Done, which is a book about organization. So yes, thanks for that. What he's saying is, there is no theory which is not then moved into organization which produces practice. It's not just theory and practice. There's not just two concepts there. There's organization. It's a core. The whole book is about organization, and yet people take that sentence out of the book and say, well, it's about theory and practice. That's because they don't want to build organizations. You can't build power unless you build organizations. We don't just want to have the right ideas. We want to build power. We want to win. I'm not struggling, by the way, for the sake of struggling. I want to win. I want to win. I want to abolish capitalism.
Me too.
I want to go beyond the system that treats people as inhumane.
We can win.
As inhumans, as
we
like
can
animals. We want to transcend this system. We don't want this. And to do that, you have to risk yourself in the world. So you can't just say, what can you do? Do something for God's sake. Next month, the International People's Assembly will be launched. If you want to know more about it, there's Manolo de los Santos standing behind the bar. He will tell you everything you want to know about the International People's Assembly. an international organization or network or platform of 200 political organizations from around the world, including the Workers' Party of Tunisia, Communist Party of Nepal, a whole range of groups. We have been building this for over 5 years. Why? Because we need international linkages. We need to build something. And you know what? Here's the other thing.
Okay, I think he's ready to go off now. This is when he's thinking about the Western left. This is VJ's face. He just thought about the Western left and their views on foreign policy, and it annoyed him in that moment. He's like, okay, here, by the way, and another thing. I got one more point here. This is when he thinks about the Western left and their foreign policy views.
We are willing to allow ourselves to fail. Because if you're not prepared to fail, you'll do nothing. That's the lesson I take from Lenin. We're building this. It's coming. You've got to get involved somehow. You've got to get involved somehow. In September, 26 research organizations from around the world are going to release a document at the United Nations. That document is going to be called A New International Economic Order. It's a nod to the 1974 New International Economic Order General Assembly resolution. 26 research institutes from South Africa, from Lebanon, from Italy, from Cuba, from Venezuela, from Argentina, from India, from China. 26 of us have come together to release this document. Look at this document. It's a post-capitalist vision. Because we don't believe in that nonsensical idea that you can't envision the world after capitalism. We believe you have to try. Because if you don't try, you won't do anything. If you're not willing to fail, friends, you will not risk anything. Don't worry if you fail. It's okay. We're human beings. When we don't have the God perspective, it's okay to fail. Don't beat each other up so viciously, because you somehow sit at God's perspective. You're there to judge the Vietnamese, to judge the Chinese. Of course, give criticisms, but not the way people do, attacking Cuba, saying it's state capitalist, it's this. I'm fed up with that kind of assessment of the world.
This is the part that I was referring to, finally. Of course, it's 33 minutes into this video. This is the part that I was referring to, finally.
So viciously, because you somehow sit at God's perspective. You're there to judge the Vietnamese, to judge the Chinese. Of course, give criticisms, but not the way people do, attacking Cuba, saying it's state capitalist, it's this. I'm fed up with that kind of assessment of the world. Be in solidarity with people as they're trying to build something. If you don't do anything and are unwilling to fail, don't be so hard on people who are trying to do something. So, the converse of that, do something, friend. I'm speaking directly to you now. Find your friends and comrades, join them, build something. Build something, it will increase your self-respect. It will also, by the way, because you'll fight better, it will also, by the way, help you understand the chapter David has written on freedom. Because this chapter is about time. We have to fight to get people the time to build the world. The struggle isn't just about wealth. It's about time. People want the time, not just for leisure. They want to love their families. They want to be with their communities. They want to be political people. We need time. Our fight against capitalism is a fight to recover time. They have stolen time from us. They have stolen our neurological systems. They've made us stressed. We don't want that shit. We want to live as people. We want to actually inaugurate history.
They have made us stressed. They've made us stressed, folks.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you.
I'm stressed too, Pam. We're all stressed. We're all stressed. Just flipped over my coffee table. Well, I'm glad we took the time to watch that. I'm glad we took the time to watch VJ. Our friend Goro from the Discord server is here. The infamous Goro. The infamous Goro of the Discord server is here. Unfortunately, you just came up at the exact end of the show. Goro, you missed the whole thing. But I would encourage everyone to go back and watch the VOD for some of the conversation if you're interested in this kind of subject matter. We had some pretty good substantive discussions today, didn't we, folks? Didn't we? Anyway, but talking about how everything has made us stressed. You know, one thing that's made me stressed is my weird gig economy position here on Twitch, where my job every single day, even though I try to come here and spread, anti-imperialist propaganda and anti-Western propaganda, ultimately my job is to get subscriptions for literally working for the biggest, most massive corporation in the world, the richest man in the world. And I'm here trying to $5 at a time carve out a small living for this massive corporation. Talk about stress. And just a few generous chatters, folks, could get us to the sub goal today. It's within reach. It's within reach. And as Vijay said, be in solidarity with people when they're trying to build something. If you want to fight back against this global imperialist system, contributing to this stream, that counts. That counts as building something like that. That counts. That's doing politics. Yeah. Go ahead and join a labor union. Okay. Join a revolutionary organization. Sure. Yes. As we all know, Twitch streams are the ultimate form of politics. And that's just the reality. That's the reality.
We simply use the computer to mark up the
Thank
size of the
you, Pam.
account.
Thank you, Pam, for the 100 friend coin. Support TRRS. Thank you, Pam. Donate directly to fill your praxis quota. Stop nitpicking and concern trolling socialists who are actually doing something. It's not like you have anything constructive to contribute anyway. I mean, that's the basic argument that we've been talking about, right? When we've accomplished something, maybe then we can sit down and start
use the computer to
lecturing
mark up
other
the
countries.
size of the account.
Solidarity to Rob. I simply use the computer to mark up the size of Rob's account. Thank you, Godzone Drunk. Once again, that is doing politics. That counts. Who needs to vote with your wallet when you can vote with your view count? Well, that counts as well. That counts as well. That's important too. You know, it's funny because I had meant to talk about, I just realized as I opened up Twitch now that I had meant to talk about the whole John Bolton coup thing. We completely neglected to talk about. We spent an hour and a half talking about Nixon, and then switched to talking about to talk about imperialism and China and all this stuff and the media. I totally skipped that whole thing. Perhaps tomorrow we can get to that. I hate that genre of leftist media that's popping up of positive leftist news where some Western leftists will list off the achievements of global South socialists who actually are doing heavy lifting, exploiting the hard work and struggle they're doing to make themselves feel better about doing nothing. Is a weak-hearted solidarity with the strikers' empty, hollow words. Yeah, not really useful. Not really useful analysis. Frankly, I'm an aspiring writer. We need fiction like they had in the Soviet Union, which was Marxist-Leninist in character. Absolutely. Also an aspiring writer over here, Goro. I'm in the process of writing a TV pilot now that I'm hoping ends up becoming an actual thing, which is also explicitly has these characteristics that I'm trying to bring to this as well. Absolutely, Gen X Bushy. We listened to Positive VJ, which is much, much better than Bad Bolton. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I think I feel a lot better. I feel a lot better having that discussion. I appreciate being informed about the Global South's victories. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that, Swamp Goth. I think what Crowd Games is talking about a kind of a very specific angle to take on that kind of reporting, though, is my understanding of what Crad Babes was saying. Not to not learn about this stuff. I guess there's a line between learning about it and kind of just like using the success of these huge social movements and then just kind of like benefiting it from yourself personally. Is that correct, you think? Okay, well, I gotta get going. I really appreciate all the support today. Thanks everyone for hanging out and for watching the stream. Well, look at that. We spent today talking a little bit about China and my feelings on what it means to be anti-imperialist and what it means to be internationalist and why I think it's important to show solidarity to China and other countries that are currently engaged in this process of building socialism. And that's something that our friend Bleep Blomp Ben is also talking about at this moment, doing something on the China debt trap myth. So that should be good stuff. I mean, that's come up this week with Sri Lanka. We've seen the political chaos in Sri Lanka and the efforts to kind of tie that. There's been the efforts in the Western media to tie that to their involvement with China economically, and completely ignoring the role that the IMF and Western imperialism and financial dominance have played in leading directly to those conditions. And trying to spin it as part of that sort of debt trap thing. So I think Ben will, she'll be doing some work today dispelling this kind of myth. So thanks again, folks. I'll talk to you tomorrow, okay? I gotta go. Gotta go pick up my kid at camp. I hope you had a nice day. Join the Discord server if you're not in there already. Final chance. Join the Discord server. Take care.